He fixed every machine in that factory. He saved every contract they ever had. Then she fired him in front of everyone, and didn't find out who he really was until 3 military helicopters landed outside her building. If that made your jaw drop, stay with me, because what happens next is going to hit you somewhere deep. This is the story of a man who chose to be invisible, a woman who thought she understood everything, and a little girl who changed both of their lives forever. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The factory floor of Harrowy Industrial smelled the same every morning: hot metal, machine oil, and something faintly chemical that stuck to the back of your throat if you breathed too deep. It wasn't a pleasant smell. Nobody who worked there would ever describe it that way. But after enough years, it became familiar in the way only unpleasant things can become familiar. It became home. Ethan Walker arrived at 5:47 a.m., same as always, 13 minutes before his official shift began. He didn't do it to impress anyone. He did it because the walk from the employee parking lot took 11 minutes when the weather was good, and he liked to spend 2 minutes in the locker room just standing still before the noise started. 2 minutes of nothing. It was the only luxury he allowed himself on work days. He was 32 years old, though most of the guys on the floor would have guessed older. Not because he looked worn down, he didn't exactly, but because there was a steadiness to him that didn't usually come until a person had been knocked around by life a few times. Medium height, not particularly broad, with hands that told a different story than the rest of him. His hands were the hands of someone who had spent years solving problems that required both precision and force, and they carried the small, permanent marks of that work. A scar along the right index finger from a hydraulic fitting that had let go without warning, a thumbnail that had grown back slightly wrong after a compression incident 3 years ago, calluses in places that most people didn't develop calluses. He kept his dark hair short because it was easier. He owned 4 pairs of the same work boots. He drove a 7-year-old pickup truck that started reliably and got him where he needed to go. The other technicians at Harrowy knew Ethan the way you know someone you work beside every day without ever really talking to. The surface knowledge, the comfortable shorthand. They knew he was quiet. They knew he was good at his job. They knew he had a daughter he picked up from school every afternoon at 3:15, which meant he never stayed late voluntarily, which some of the older guys held against him in a vague, unspoken way until they actually needed something fixed and he was the one who fixed it. His name on the employment roster read Ethan Walker, Machine Technician 2, Harrowy Industrial, Allenwood Plant, Pennsylvania. That was all it said. That was, by design, all anyone needed to know. The plant had 3 production lines. Line 1 ran stamped metal components for automotive suppliers. Line 2 ran precision cut parts for agricultural equipment. Line 3 was newer, retrofitted 18 months ago to handle components for a defense contractor out of Virginia. Classified parts that nobody on the floor asked too many questions about, because the money was good, and good money kept the plant running, and the plant running kept 431 people employed in a county that didn't have a lot of other options. Line 3 was also, by a significant margin, the most temperamental piece of industrial infrastructure Ethan had ever worked with. He'd known it from the first week the line went operational. There was a resonance problem in the secondary drive assembly, barely detectable, the kind of thing that only showed up in the data if you knew exactly what you were looking for, that put a specific harmonic stress on the main bearing housing. The original engineering team had missed it. The installation crew had missed it. The 2 senior technicians who'd signed off on the commissioning report had missed it. Ethan had not missed it. He'd written it up in a maintenance note and submitted it through the proper channels. The note had gone to his floor supervisor, Marcus Gaines, who had forwarded it upward with a polite bureaucratic summary that softened the edges of what Ethan had actually said. Somewhere in the chain of approval above Marcus, someone had decided the issue was within acceptable tolerances and filed the note away. Ethan had read the response, nodded once to himself, and gone back to work. That had been 16 months ago. Since then, he'd been quietly compensating for the resonance problem every time he ran maintenance on Line 3, adjusting the preload on the bearing housing, varying the torque sequence on the drive bolts in a way that redistributed stress, making small calibrations that weren't in the official maintenance manual, but that had, so far, prevented the bearing housing from failing in exactly the catastrophic way he'd predicted it eventually would. He hadn't written this up. He'd thought about it. He drafted a second maintenance note in his head a dozen times. But the first one hadn't gone anywhere, and Ethan had learned a long time ago that there were two ways to deal with a problem. You could fight the institution over it, or you could just fix it. He didn't have the energy to fight institutions anymore. He had a daughter to raise and a truck payment and a grocery list that needed attention every Sunday. So he fixed it quietly, without telling anyone, and moved on. This was, he would later understand, both the best thing about him and the thing that was going to create the worst day of his life. Charlotte Hayes arrived at Harroway Industrial every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, because 8 o'clock was when the day officially started, and Charlotte did not see the point in arriving before the day started. She was 30 years old, which made her young for a CEO of a company this size, and she was aware of that, and she used the awareness the way some people use a bruise, pressing on it occasionally to make sure it still hurt, which kept her sharp. She had an MBA from Wharton, a background in operations management, and a mind that processed information the way Line 2 processed steel blanks, efficiently, without sentiment, with a clear and measurable output at the end. She had been brought in 14 months ago by the Harroway board to modernize operations, cut costs, and position the company for a potential acquisition that several private equity firms had been circling around for the better part of a year. She was good at her job. She was genuinely rigorously good at it, and she knew it, and that certainty was both her greatest professional asset and the thing that occasionally made her a pain in the ass to work for. Her office was on the second floor of the plant's administrative building, with a window that looked out over the main production floor. She had not specifically requested this view when she took the position, but she'd come to value it. She could see the entire floor from up there, the rhythm of the lines, the movement of the workers, the small disruptions and recoveries that happened a dozen times a day in any functioning manufacturing operation. She could read a factory floor the way some people read faces, and she had learned more about Harrow's operational health from that window than from any of the reports that landed in her inbox. It was from that window, 11 months ago, that she had first noticed Ethan Walker. She'd been watching Line 1 during a shift because one of the productivity metrics had shown a dip that didn't have an obvious explanation. She'd been looking for inefficiencies, idle time, misallocated resources, that kind of thing. Instead, she'd watched a technician she didn't recognize by name walk directly to a piece of equipment that was running slightly wrong in a way she couldn't even articulate. It was more of a feeling, the kind of thing you notice when you've spent enough time watching a system, and spend 4 minutes working on it before stepping back and letting the line resume its normal pace. The metric had corrected itself by the end of that shift. She'd pulled up his name from the maintenance log. Ethan Walker, Tech 2. She'd looked at his personnel file. Standard background, 7 years with the company. No formal complaints, no disciplinary actions, one performance review that described him as reliable and technically proficient in the kind of language HR used when they didn't have anything bad to say but weren't particularly paying attention. She'd watched him again the following day, and the day after that. Not obsessively, she had an actual company to run, but with the particular attention she gave to things that didn't quite add up. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged that she found genuinely puzzling. Every time something went wrong with any of the 3 production lines, and things went wrong regularly, because that was the nature of running complex equipment at high volume, Ethan Walker seemed to materialize at the problem site before anyone had officially logged a work order. He would assess, work, and step back. The problem would resolve. He would return to whatever he'd been doing before as if nothing had happened. Charlotte had a master's degree in operations management. She understood maintenance systems. She understood response protocols, work order pipelines, escalation procedures. What Ethan was doing didn't fit cleanly into any of those categories because he wasn't waiting for any of them. He was operating on some kind of parallel track that existed entirely outside the official maintenance structure. This bothered her. Not because the outcomes were bad, the outcomes were objectively excellent, but because Charlotte had been brought in to build an efficient, process-compliant organization, and a technician who improvised his way around official procedures was by definition a process compliance problem. Even if the improvisation was working, especially if it was working, because that meant the unofficial workarounds were becoming load-bearing, which created dependencies that couldn't be measured, audited, or replicated. She asked Marcus Gaines about Ethan Walker one afternoon, keeping her voice casual. Marcus had paused for a moment before answering, in the way people pause when they're deciding how much to say. He's solid, Marcus had told her. Probably the best diagnostic eye on the floor, knows these machines better than the people who built them. He bypasses the work order system, Charlotte had said. Marcus had shrugged. He usually has things sorted out before a work order would have even been assigned. That's not the point. No, Marcus had agreed. I know it's not. Charlotte had made a note in her mental file on Ethan Walker. Talented. Non-compliant. Needs managing. She hadn't acted on it yet. She was building a case the way she always built cases. Systematically, without rushing, making sure she had the complete picture before she moved. She didn't know, watching him from her second-floor window, that the complete picture was considerably more complicated than anything in his personnel file. Tita. On a Tuesday morning in the second week of March, Ethan dropped Ava off at school and watched her run across the wet parking lot toward the entrance doors without looking back, the way 8-year-olds do when they've already moved on to the next thing in their heads. Her backpack bounced. She was wearing the yellow raincoat that was slightly too big for her because he'd bought the next size up so it would last another year. He sat in the truck for a moment after she disappeared inside. There was a photograph on the dashboard tucked against the windshield where the defroster vents were. It was a candid shot, slightly blurry at the edges. Ava at 6 years old, laughing at something off camera, her head thrown back in that uninhibited way little kids laugh before they learn to be self-conscious about it. He'd taken it at a park in the fall, 2 weeks before everything in their lives changed. He looked at it every morning, not as a ritual, not as a deliberate act of remembrance. He looked at it because it was there, and because she was the reason he did every single thing he did. He put the truck in drive and headed for the factory. The Harrowy Allenwood plant was a long, low building set back from Route 15 behind a chain-link fence and a parking lot that needed repaving. The sign out front was clean and well lit, one of the first things Charlotte had updated when she arrived. But the building itself was 22 years old and wore its age in the way industrial buildings do, with stained concrete and patched roof sections and loading dock doors that stuck in cold weather. Inside, though, it was a functioning, well-organized operation. Charlotte had spent her first 3 months tearing out inefficiencies and reorganizing the floor layout, and the results had been measurable. Cycle times down 11%, waste down 14%, on-time delivery up to 93% from an embarrassing 78%. She was proud of those numbers. They were real, earned, and they'd come from hard decisions and late nights and more than a few arguments with department heads who thought she was moving too fast. Ethan walked in at 5:47 a.m., changed into his work clothes, spent 2 minutes standing in the locker room in the quiet before the shift started, and then went to work. The first hour was routine. He ran through his morning checks on Line 2, the agricultural line, which was in the middle of a high-volume production run for a spring equipment order, calibrated a feed roller that had been running slightly fast, and replaced a worn sensor housing on the cutting station before it had the chance to fail. He was working on a minor pneumatic issue at the far end of Line 1 when Darren Cole, one of the junior technicians, came jogging toward him at 8:23 a.m. with the particular expression people wore when something had gone wrong but they weren't sure how wrong. "Line 3's making a noise," Darren said. Ethan put down his tools and walked. The noise was bad, not in the way that required expertise to identify as bad. It was bad in the way that made the 3 workers stationed at that end of the floor take several instinctive steps backward. A grinding, rhythmic percussion that didn't belong in any part of Line 3's normal operating sound, layered under the mechanical baseline like something with teeth catching where it shouldn't. Ethan stood in front of the primary drive housing and listened. He knew exactly what it was. The bearing housing, the one he'd been compensating for since the first month the line went live. The one where the resonance damage had been quietly accumulating in the metal for 16 months, had finally progressed beyond the point where his adjustments could manage it. The outer race had started to separate. If Line 3 kept running, the housing would fail completely within the next 4 to 6 hours, maybe less depending on production load. When it failed, it wouldn't just shut down Line 3. The failure mode would propagate through the drivetrain and likely damage 3 downstream components that were not easy or cheap to replace. The defense contract components currently in production would be destroyed. The contract deadline was in 31 hours. He needed a specific replacement bearing, 3 specialized tools from the maintenance crib, and approximately 50 minutes of uninterrupted access to the machine. He turned to Darren. "Shut the line down. Don't restart it. I need to go to the crib." "What is it?" "Bearing housing. I'll explain after. Shut it down." Darren moved toward the control panel. Ethan was already walking toward the maintenance crib at the back of the building, running through the repair sequence in his head, calculating whether the bearing he needed was in stock. He was fairly sure it was. He'd checked inventory 3 weeks ago specifically because he'd known this was coming. He was 20 feet from the crib door when he heard his name. "Ethan Walker." The voice carried across the floor. Not loud exactly, but projected with the deliberate clarity of someone who had learned how to fill a room without raising their volume. Charlotte Hayes' voice, coming from behind him. He turned. She was standing in the middle of the floor, not in her usual spot near the administrative corridor, but here, on the production floor itself, in a blazer and slacks that were several calibration levels above the dress code of everyone around her. Beside her stood Richard Farwell, the plant operations director, a thick-necked man in his 50s who had been at Harrow for 20 years and who had, in Charlotte's first 6 months, been the source of approximately 40% of her compliance problems. He was standing with his arms crossed in a way that suggested he was not entirely unhappy about whatever was happening. The floor had gone quieter. It does that, Ethan had noticed, when management steps out of its normal habitat. People slow down. They become aware of being watched. Charlotte had a tablet in her hand. She looked at it, then at him, with the focused expression of someone executing a plan they'd been building for a while. "I'd like to talk to you," she said. "Now." Ethan glanced toward the maintenance crib. "I'm in the middle of something. Line 3 has been shut down. I know." She held up the tablet slightly. "I need to discuss a compliance matter with you. It can wait 45 minutes. "It can't." The finality in her voice had a shape to it, not impatient, measured. She'd decided this was happening, and she'd decided it before she walked out here. "This has been building for some time. I have documentation." Ethan looked at her. He felt something tighten in his chest. Not anger, not exactly, but the recognition of a situation that had stopped being negotiable. He'd seen that look before, not on her specifically, on people who had decided they already knew the answer and were now performing the question. "Okay," he said. He put his hands in his pockets and waited. Charlotte opened a document on her tablet and began to speak in a clear, unhurried voice. By this point, the floor was paying attention. Not dramatically. Nobody put down their tools and gathered around, but the awareness was there, the angled glances, the slowed pace of people who were listening without appearing to listen. She walked through 11 documented incidents over the previous 9 months. Each one was a situation where Ethan had intervened in a production problem without filing a proper work order, without clearing the action through his supervisor, without following the established maintenance protocol. She was accurate on every detail. She'd done her homework. Each incident was time-stamped, cross-referenced with production logs, documented with quiet precision. "In each of these cases," she said, "you operated outside established company procedure. You bypassed the work order system. You made unilateral decisions about machine operation and repair that were not authorized under your role classification." Ethan listened. He didn't interrupt. Around them, the floor had gone the quietest it had been since he'd arrived this morning. "I understand the outcomes were positive," she continued, "but Harrow Industrial cannot operate on the basis of one individual making undocumented decisions about complex manufacturing equipment. That creates liability, it creates safety exposure, it creates operational dependencies we can't audit or account for." She lowered the tablet. "Effective immediately, your employment with Harrow Industrial is terminated. You'll be walked out by building security and provided with your severance documentation by the end of the day. Any tools or personal items in your locker will be available for collection during business hours this week." The words landed in the silence of the floor. Ethan stood still for a moment. He was aware of people watching him. He was aware of the sound Line 3 was no longer making, which was somehow louder than the sound it had been making before. He was aware of the tightening in his chest that he was, with some effort, keeping from his face. He thought about the bearing housing. He thought about the 31 hours until the contract deadline. He thought about 431 people and what it meant if that deadline got missed. He thought about Ava. "Charlotte," he said. Not Ms. Hayes. Charlotte. He said it evenly, without aggression. Line 3 needs a bearing housing replacement before it's run again. The specific part number is HX7740B. It should be in inventory. The repair sequence takes about 50 minutes if you know what you're doing. She stared at him. "That machine fails completely, and you're looking at losing the contract," he said. "The damage won't be covered by the warranty on the line installation because the root cause is a resonance issue in the secondary drive assembly that was documented 16 months ago. I can write that up for you if you want the reference number." Something moved through her expression, not doubt. She wasn't there yet, but a flicker of something that might have been the first, very early stage of it. "Security will walk you out," she said. Ethan nodded once. He looked around the floor, not looking for anything, just the way you look at a place you've spent years of your life when you understand you're seeing it for the last time. He looked at Marcus, who was standing by the Line 2 control panel with an expression that mixed genuine distress with the specific helplessness of a middle manager watching something happen above his authority level. Then he walked to the locker room, took his jacket and his keys and the small framed photo of Ava that he kept on the upper shelf, and he walked out of the building. His daughter was in school 3 miles away. He sat in the truck in the parking lot for a moment, the engine off, the Pennsylvania morning gray and cold around him. He pulled out his phone and looked at the time. She wouldn't be done until 3:15. He had about 6 hours. He wasn't thinking about injustice. He wasn't cataloging his grievances. He was thinking about what to make for dinner and whether he'd remembered to put the permission slip for Ava's field trip in her backpack this morning, and whether she'd remember to ask her teacher about the science project the way he'd reminded her to. He started the truck. He drove home. Back inside the plant, the meeting between Charlotte and the senior engineering team lasted 27 minutes and produced nothing useful. The 2 staff engineers assigned to Line 3, both of them competent men with good credentials and solid experience in standard manufacturing environments, had been called to assess the situation. They had spent 20 minutes examining the drive assembly with growing expressions that Charlotte did not find reassuring. They used words like anomalous and non-standard configuration, and unclear how this has been maintained in operational condition in a way that suggested they were describing a patient they didn't quite understand the medical history of. Richard Farwell stood in the back of the room with his arms still crossed. He'd uncrossed them briefly when the engineers started their report and then crossed them again, which Charlotte recognized as a bad sign. "What's the repair timeline?" she asked. The lead engineer, whose name was Hendricks, exchanged a look with his colleague before answering. "We'd need to bring in an outside specialist for this. The configuration is... There's some non-standard work here that isn't in any of the documentation we have. We're not comfortable proceeding without understanding what modifications have been made and why." Charlotte felt the first cold finger of something trace down her spine. "Time frame," she said. "Give me a number." Hendricks hesitated. "Minimum 4 to 6 days if we get the right specialist in quickly. Could be longer if there are complications with the drivetrain." The contract deadline was 31 hours away. Charlotte walked back to her office, closed the door, and stood at the window looking down at Line 3. The machine sat still and silent in a way that felt absurdly, almost intentional, like it was making a point. She pulled Ethan Walker's file back up on her computer. She went through it again, more carefully this time, looking for the things she had apparently missed. She found what she was looking for. Or rather, she found what wasn't there. His employment application from 7 years ago listed his education as a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Penn State. Standard enough. His references had been 3 former employers, all manufacturing companies, all of whom had provided positive but unremarkable assessments. His resume showed a steady progression of technician roles across different facilities over the preceding decade. It was, she realized now, staring at it, a perfect document. Too clean, too self-contained. The kind of resume that told you exactly as much as it needed to tell you, and not one thing more. She picked up her phone and called a contact at a professional background verification service she had used during executive hiring processes. "I need a deep search," she said. "Everything you can find on a subject. Name is Ethan Walker. 32, Pennsylvania, mechanical engineering background. She gave him Ethan's social security number from the employment file. How soon? The contact asked. Yesterday, Charlotte said. She put the phone down and looked at the clock. 29 hours, 40 minutes until the contract deadline. Outside, on the floor, Line 3 sat silent and still, and the whole plant was beginning to understand slowly, in the way plants understand things, that something had gone very wrong. Marcus Gaines knocked on Charlotte's office door at 12:14 p.m. She'd been in the building all morning, running the situation in parallel tracks, managing the contract partner's account team, who had called twice already with questions she wasn't able to answer to their satisfaction, fielding calls from the plant's legal team about penalty exposure, trying to get a specialist on the phone who could turn around a site visit in under 24 hours, which was proving to be approximately as easy as it sounded. Marcus came in and closed the door and stood with his hands loose at his sides, in the way of a man who had something to say and was going to say it regardless of how it landed. I should have said more, he told her, about Ethan, when you asked. Charlotte looked up from her desk. I knew he worked outside procedure, Marcus said. I also knew the plant ran better when he did. I told myself it wasn't my place to argue with the direction you were taking, and I let it go. That was wrong. Charlotte waited. He's been compensating for a design flaw in Line 3 since it went live, Marcus said. He wrote it up originally. The report got buried, and instead of fighting it, he just quietly worked around it, every month, without telling anyone. He exhaled. I knew he was doing something like that. I didn't know the specifics. Charlotte was very still. He also, Marcus continued, kept Line 2 running through that whole stretch last fall when we had the hydraulic supply issues, fixed a sensor cascade on Line 1 in February that would have shut down the whole line for 3 days if it had progressed. And there are at least 4 situations in the past year where he caught something before it became a problem. And if you look at the maintenance logs, you can see his notes, but they're logged as routine preventive maintenance because that's how he wrote them up to keep things simple. He stopped. He looked at her with the direct, tired expression of a man who had been on the floor for 20 years and had very few illusions left about anything. He's not a technician, Marcus said. I mean, he is. He does the work, and he does it better than anyone I've ever seen, but he's not. What's on his file isn't who he is. I don't know what the full story is. I never asked. But whatever he was before he came here, it wasn't a Tech 2. After Marcus left, Charlotte sat for a long moment without moving. Her background check contact called back at 1:47 p.m. The call lasted 11 minutes. For most of it, Charlotte didn't say anything. She held the phone against her ear and listened and looked at the middle distance with an expression that wasn't quite any single emotion she could name. When she put the phone down, she looked at the clock on her desk. 27 hours and 13 minutes until the contract deadline. She needed to find Ethan Walker. God. He was in the backyard of a small house in a residential neighborhood 4 miles from the plant, crouched next to a section of fence that had been damaged in a windstorm the previous week, and that he'd been putting off repairing because work had been relentless. He'd stopped at the hardware store on the way home, bought the materials, and spent the early afternoon doing the work. It was uncomplicated, physical, satisfying in the way that simple repairs are satisfying when your day has been the kind of day his had been. His phone was in his jacket pocket. He'd turned the sound off. He'd gotten 4 calls from numbers he recognized as the plant's main line and 2 from Marcus's cell, and he hadn't answered any of them. At 2:45, Ava's school called. The display said Northbrook Elementary. And he answered it immediately, his heart doing the involuntary thing it always did when that number showed up. It was just the attendance office confirming that he would be picking Ava up at 3:15. He said yes, of course. He cleaned up the fence repair, washed his hands, changed out of his work clothes, and drove to the school. Ava came running out at 3:17. She was talking before she reached the truck, something about a math test and a girl named Petra who had braided her hair at recess, and could she have a grilled cheese for dinner? He said yes to the grilled cheese. He merged back onto the road toward home. You're home early, Ava said. Yeah, Ethan said. How come? He thought about this for a second. Change of plans at work. Ava absorbed this with the practical incuriosity of a child who doesn't yet understand that adults have anxieties about employment. She went back to the story about the math test. They were 4 blocks from home when Ethan noticed the black SUV parked outside their house. Government plates. He looked at it without expression, pulled into the driveway, and sat for a moment. "Stay in the truck for a second, okay?" he told Ava. "Why?" "I just need to check something." He got out. There were 2 of them. One stayed near the SUV, and one walked toward him across the lawn. They were military, but out of uniform, in civilian clothes with the specific posture and bearing that can't be turned off. The one who came toward him was in his 40s, with the kind of face that had seen a lot without making a performance of it. He stopped a few feet from Ethan. "Dr. Walker," he said. Nobody at Harrow Industrial had ever called him that. "I know why you're here," Ethan said. "Yes, sir," the officer said. "I figured you might." Ethan looked back at the truck. Through the windshield, Ava was watching him with wide, patient eyes. He raised one hand toward her, "Just a minute," and turned back. "Tell me what's happening," he said. The officer told him. The defense contract, the machine, the timeline, and something else. Something that the officer said quietly, professionally, without editorializing, but that landed on Ethan with the full weight of everything it meant. The components currently in Line 3's production queue weren't generic. They were part of a replacement supply run for a propulsion system that the officer could not specify, but which Ethan, from the part numbers alone, which he'd memorized months ago because that was how his mind worked, recognized immediately. A system he had, years earlier, in a different life, helped design. He stood in his yard in the cold March afternoon and felt the past and the present collide in the specific, disorienting way they sometimes do when you think you've buried something and it turns out it's been there all along. He went back to the truck. "Hey," he said, opening Ava's door. "We have to make a stop before home. It won't take long." Ava looked at the men by the SUV. "Who are they?" "People I used to work with," Ethan said, "a long time ago." "The grilled cheese?" "I'll make it after," he said. "I promise." She studied him for a moment with the particular seriousness that children sometimes have, where they're reading something they don't have language for. Then she nodded. He closed her door and pulled out his phone. He called the number that had been calling him from the plant's main line all afternoon. Charlotte answered on the first ring. "I need Ava to be able to stay in your office while I work," Ethan said. "She needs a quiet space and Wi-Fi access. She has homework." There was a brief silence. "Of course," Charlotte said. Her voice was different than it had been this morning. He couldn't quite place the difference, but it was there. "I'll need the machine room cleared, just me." He paused. "And I'll need someone to look up a part in inventory, HX774OB. Like I said this morning." "It's already pulled and waiting," Charlotte said quietly. Ethan got back in the truck. "Ready?" Ava asked. "Yeah," he said. He backed out of the driveway. "Yeah, I'm ready." He drove toward the factory, and the afternoon light was going gray and thin through the clouds, and the city moved around the truck in its ordinary way. And somewhere above it all, 3 military helicopters had already begun their approach toward a landing zone in the open lot behind Harrow Industrial's Allenwood plant, because some things, it turned out, refused to stay buried no matter how carefully you'd set them down. When Ethan walked back through the plant's main entrance at 4:32 p.m., the floor went quiet in a different way than it had gone quiet that morning. Not the cautious silence of people watching management exercise authority. Something else. Something that was partly confusion and partly the instinctive recognition that a situation had moved into territory that none of them had a framework for. Charlotte was waiting near the Line 3 bay with Marcus and Hendricks and 3 other members of the engineering team. She had changed something about the way she was standing, or maybe nothing had changed and Ethan was just seeing it differently now. And when she looked at him, the measured executive composure was still there, but there was something unsteady beneath it, and she didn't try to hide it. Ava stood beside him, backpack on, looking around the factory floor with wide, interested eyes. "The laptop in my office has Disney Plus on it," Charlotte said, and her voice was careful in the way it gets when someone is managing several things at once. "There's also a snack drawer in the left cabinet. Ava looked up at Ethan. He nodded. She went with Charlotte's assistant, who had appeared for this purpose, without protest. Ethan turned to the machine. He didn't look at anyone else. He walked to the Line 3 drive assembly, crouched down, and put his hands on the housing in the way you put your hands on something you know well. He stayed still for a moment, not doing anything visible, just listening. Then he started to work. And nobody who watched him work that afternoon would ever again quite believe what his personnel file said. He worked without talking. That was the first thing the engineers noticed. Not the speed, not the specific movements, but the silence. Hendricks had worked with a lot of technicians and specialists over the years, the kind of people who narrated their process as they went, explaining what they were doing partly for documentation purposes and partly because talking helped them think. Ethan didn't do that. He moved through the repair sequence with a focused interior quiet that made the air around him feel different, like standing near someone reading something important. The Line 3 drive assembly was a complicated piece of equipment. The primary housing alone had 37 bolts in a specific torque pattern, and the bearing removal required a puller setup that Hendricks had spent 40 minutes earlier in the day failing to configure correctly because the geometry of the housing didn't match the standard specifications in the installation manual. He'd assumed the manual was right and the machine was wrong. Now he watched Ethan set up the same puller in under 6 minutes, with 2 modifications to the attachment points that seemed obvious in retrospect, but that Hendricks would not have arrived at on his own in anything under an hour of trial and error. Charlotte stood back. She told herself she was giving him space to work, which was true, but it was also true that she needed the distance. She needed somewhere to put the feeling that had been sitting in her chest since 1:47 p.m. when she'd put down the phone after her background check contact finished talking, and she hadn't found a place for it yet. What she had learned in those 11 minutes was this: Ethan Walker. The full, actual Ethan Walker, not the version that lived in a Harrowy industrial personnel file, held a doctorate in mechanical and aerospace engineering from MIT. He had graduated at 24. He had spent the following 6 years working as a senior consultant for a defense research division whose exact organizational structure her contact had been careful about, but whose work involved propulsion systems for next-generation military aircraft. He had published 11 peer-reviewed papers in engineering journals, 3 of which were still cited regularly in the field. He had been part of a team that received a national commendation for engineering innovation, which was the kind of commendation that didn't show up on resumes because it came with classification conditions attached. He had left that world 3 years ago. His wife had died. An aneurysm, sudden, no warning, which was the kind of loss that hit people differently than illness did, because there was no preparation, no goodbye, nothing except the ordinary morning that became the last one. She'd been 29. Ava had been 5. After that, he had taken his daughter, relocated to Pennsylvania, and applied for a machine technician position at a manufacturing plant where nobody knew his name or his history, and he had apparently intended to keep it that way indefinitely. Charlotte had stood at her office window after the call and looked down at the floor, at the silent Line 3 machine, and tried to build a coherent picture of a man who was capable of all of that, and had chosen, deliberately, intentionally, with full knowledge of what he was walking away from, to become invisible. She couldn't quite do it, not yet. The picture kept shifting. Now she watched him work, and she watched the engineers watching him work, and she felt something she was not used to feeling in professional contexts, that she had been comprehensively wrong about something in a way that wasn't about a spreadsheet or a strategy, but about a person, about who a person was. That kind of wrong was harder to sit with. Marcus brought 2 coffees at some point and set one on a crate near where Charlotte was standing without saying anything. She drank half of it without tasting it. At 5:20, Ethan looked over his shoulder. I need the HX7740B. The part had been sitting on a cart 3 feet away since Charlotte had it pulled from inventory 2 hours ago. One of the engineers brought it forward. Ethan examined it, turned it in his hands, ran his thumb across the bearing race with a delicacy that seemed disproportionate to the size of the part, and then said, "This one's fine," and went back to work. Hendricks leaned slightly toward Charlotte. "That inspection would have taken me a micrometer in about 20 minutes, he said quietly. He did it by hand in 10 seconds. Charlotte didn't respond. She was watching Ethan's hands. At 5:51 p.m., he stood up and stepped back from the machine. "Run a dry cycle first," he said. "Low speed, no production load. 30 minutes. Then come back and tell me what you hear." He looked at Charlotte. His expression was the same as it had been that morning. Not guarded exactly, but contained, like he'd decided a long time ago not to spend energy on things that were over. "Where?" she started. "Your office," he said. "Ava." He walked away before she could say anything else. Ava had apparently eaten all the crackers in Charlotte's snack drawer and discovered that Charlotte's office had a couch, which she had arranged herself on with the laptop and a throw blanket that she'd found folded on the bookshelf, and was watching something animated with the focused contentment of a child who has made herself at home in a place she has no reason to feel uncomfortable. Ethan came in and sat in the chair beside her. He was still in his work clothes, which were now substantially worse off than when he'd put them on, and he smelled like machine oil and the particular metallic sharpness of opened bearing housings. He looked exhausted in a way that was visible mainly around his eyes. Ava looked up from the laptop screen. "Did you fix it?" "Yeah." "Was it a hard one?" "Not really," he said. Then, more honestly, "It would have been bad if it had gone further." Ava turned the laptop volume down slightly, out of some courtesy that she hadn't been taught but had arrived at on her own. "Are you in trouble?" Ethan looked at her. "What makes you ask that?" She shrugged the way kids shrug when they know more than they're saying. "You seemed like you were in trouble this morning, when you said change of plans." He was quiet for a second. "I lost my job today." Ava processed this. "The one here?" "Yeah." "And then you came back to fix their thing anyway?" "Yeah." She looked at him with the direct, slightly judgmental gaze of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned to soften the obvious. "That seems like it benefits them more than you." Ethan almost smiled. "A lot of people work there," he said. "It's not just them." Ava turned this over. She was satisfied enough with the answer to return to her show, but she reached over and put her hand on his forearm for a second before she did. An unconscious gesture, the kind that doesn't mean anything specific and means everything, and then took it back and pulled the blanket up and settled in. Ethan sat in the chair and looked at the ceiling and let the day settle around him. Charlotte came to her own office at 6:18, which was strange enough as a sentence that it felt like it deserved acknowledgement. She stopped in the doorway and took in the scene, Ethan in the chair, Ava on the couch with the laptop, the empty cracker packaging on the side table, and something moved through her face before she composed it. "Dry cycle finished," she said. "Marcus said it sounds clean." Ethan nodded. "Run it at half load for a couple hours before you go back to full production. If there's any deviation in the drive harmonics, shut it down and call me, but there won't be." "Okay." Charlotte stood in the doorway. She was clearly in the middle of deciding something. "Can we talk?" Ethan looked at Ava, who had put her headphones in with the practiced timing of a child who understood that adults sometimes needed the room without being told. Charlotte came in and sat down behind her desk, which should have been the home position, her territory, her authority, but somehow didn't read that way. She folded her hands on the desk and then unfolded them, which was, Ethan suspected, a rare visible sign of discomfort in a person who didn't usually show those. "I made calls today," she said. After this morning. I found out some things about your background that weren't in your file." "I know," Ethan said. "You know I made calls?" "I know what you would have found." Charlotte looked at him. "Why didn't any of it show up in the standard background check when you were hired?" "Because I made sure it wouldn't." The directness of this seemed to surprise her slightly. "How?" "References who knew what I was doing and why. A resume that was accurate about the technician work I'd done before the other stuff. No lies, just selective." He paused. "I needed a job where I could get Ava to school at 8 and pick her up at 3:15. I needed something that wouldn't follow me home at night. I didn't need anyone to know who I used to be." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Outside the office window, the floor had come back to life in a low, cautious way. The sound of people resuming work after a disruption, the half-speed rhythm of a place that's been shaken and hasn't quite found its footing again. The military officers outside, she said. Former colleagues, Ethan said. The components on line 3 are for a system I have some history with. Someone noticed when production stopped. They came here for you. They came because the timeline was critical and they didn't have other options. He looked at his hands, which still had grease in the creases of his knuckles. I'm not what I was. I don't have active clearance anymore. I'm not on any project. I just happen to know that specific equipment in a way that apparently isn't common. Apparently, Charlotte said, with something dry and slightly pained in her voice. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet that exists between two people who are both aware that a conversation is happening on multiple levels simultaneously. I'm sorry, Charlotte said. She said it simply, without building up to it, which was, Ethan was learning, how she did things that cost her something. You were doing your job, he said. I was doing my job badly, she said. There's a difference. I had evidence of a problem, and I diagnosed it based on the framework I walked in with instead of the information in front of me. She paused. In operations management, we call that confirmation bias. When I teach it to people, I'm quite good at explaining why it's a problem. The corner of Ethan's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. I also, Charlotte continued, publicly terminated you in front of the entire production floor, which was, she seemed to look for the precise word, unnecessary. Even if the termination itself had been correct, which it wasn't, the way it was handled was, I was making a point, and that was about me, not about you or the company. Yeah, Ethan said. I noticed. I imagine you did. She exhaled. Richard Farwell has had 3 complaints filed against him in the past 8 months for floor behavior that I've been slow to act on because he's been here 20 years and the board respects his tenure. He was standing right behind me this morning and I wasn't unaware of the dynamic. I was using it. She said this with the flat, clear voice of someone holding themselves accountable out loud, which was uncomfortable to do and which she was doing anyway. That was wrong. Ethan was quiet. He looked at her with a steadiness that wasn't suspicion and wasn't forgiveness yet. It was just presence, the kind of attention you give something you haven't decided how to feel about yet. The thing about the resonance issue, he said, in the Line 3 drive assembly. I submitted a report 16 months ago. I know, I pulled it today. She looked slightly ill. It's in a compliance archive. It never reached anyone who would have acted on it. I know, he said. That's why I stopped submitting reports. This landed quietly between them. Charlotte absorbed it without defending herself. She'd spent enough of the afternoon sitting with her own failures that she didn't have the energy to rationalize them anymore. How many other things, she said slowly, are you quietly compensating for in this plant that we don't know about? A few, Ethan said. I need a list. I know. He looked toward Ava, who had fallen slightly sideways on the couch, the laptop tilted, one earbud half out. She'd be asleep in about 10 minutes. She always did this when she was somewhere new, pushed until her body just stopped. Can I send it tomorrow? Yes, Charlotte said. Of course. A beat of quiet. There are 3 military officers outside my building, Charlotte said. In helicopters. They landed in the back lot, and 3 of my line workers think we're being raided. I'll talk to them, Ethan said. They can go. It's handled. They came all the way here. They came because they were worried I wouldn't engage. I engaged. They can go. He said this without arrogance. It was just a factual description of a transaction. The officers had a concern. The concern had been addressed. The situation was resolved. Charlotte looked at him for a moment. Do you miss it? She asked. The other work. Ethan didn't answer immediately. It wasn't that the question required much thought. He'd thought about it a great deal over the past 3 years, at odd moments, the way you think about roads you didn't take. It was more that the answer was complicated enough that a fast response would have been dishonest. Parts of it, he said. The problems themselves. There's nothing like certain kinds of engineering problems, the ones where the margin is real, where something genuinely doesn't work yet, and you're the one who has to figure out why. I miss that. He paused. I don't miss the rest. The clearance reviews, the institutional friction, the traveling, the way it ate everything around it. He looked at Ava again. She had a kindergarten play, her first one. I missed it because I was in a briefing that ran long and the flight didn't make it. She didn't say anything about it. She just didn't say anything. She was 5. Charlotte was very still. I was done after that, he said. Not right away. It took me about a month to build the nerve, and then Julia... He stopped, cleared his throat once. And then everything changed, and being there wasn't optional anymore. It was the only thing. The office was quiet. Outside, the floor hummed with the low sound of a plant returning to normal operations. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang and was answered. I should get her home, Ethan said. Yes. Charlotte stood, which was automatic, the way she stood when meetings ended. Then she seemed to remember they weren't in a meeting and stood there slightly awkwardly for a second, which was an expression Ethan suspected she didn't often have. Your job, she said. Your position. I'd like to talk about that. Tomorrow. If you're willing. I'll come by at 9, Ethan said. Okay. She moved around the desk. She stopped at the couch and looked at Ava for a moment. The sleeping 8-year-old wrapped in her office throw blanket, headphones around her neck, cracker crumbs on the cushion, and her expression was something he didn't try to name. She picked up the laptop gently and moved it to the table so it wouldn't fall. I'll send someone to bring your truck around to the front, she said quietly, so you don't have to carry her far. Ethan looked at her. Thanks, he said. She left. He sat in the quiet for another minute before waking Ava gently, the way you wake someone who's in that first light layer of sleep. A hand on the shoulder, her name, softly, twice. She came awake with the slightly bewildered expression of a child who'd forgotten where they were, looked around the office, and then found his face. Time to go? She said. Time to go, he said. She reached up and he lifted her, and she settled against him with the complete, unguarded weight of someone who trusted completely, her head on his shoulder, the blanket trailing. He carried her toward the door. The 3 military officers were waiting near the front entrance when Ethan came out, Ava drowsy against his shoulder. The one who'd come to his yard that afternoon, whose name was Colonel Bauer, though nobody had used rank or name out loud today, stood slightly apart from the other 2 with the considered posture of a man who'd learned to read situations. Bauer looked at Ava for a moment, then back at Ethan. Contract secure? He said. Production can resume tonight, Ethan said. Full load by morning. Bauer nodded once. There's a project. No, Ethan said. Bauer looked at him with an expression that wasn't surprised exactly, but was doing some adjustment. You haven't heard what it is. It doesn't matter what it is. Ethan. Bauer's voice dropped slightly. Not a pressure, more a genuine directness. The work you did on that system, the Valdris configuration, there are problems downstream that nobody has been able to resolve. You'd know within 10 minutes of looking at the specs. We're talking about 18 months of stalled progress. Then it'll be 19, Ethan said. He said it without anger, without contempt. He said it the way you state a decision that's already been made. That was made 3 years ago in a kindergarten auditorium, watching an empty seat stay empty. A decision that was reinforced every morning when he watched a yellow raincoat disappear through school doors. Bauer looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded. A slower nod this time, the kind that isn't agreement but is recognition. All right, he said. The plant will document the repair tonight, Ethan said. I'll send a detailed write-up by morning. Anything relevant to the component specs for the contract I'll include. Appreciated. Ava had stirred slightly and was looking at Bauer with the frank appraisal of a child who hasn't yet learned that staring is rude. Bauer looked back at her. Hi, Ava said. Hello, Bauer said, with the slightly careful courtesy of a military man who did not spend a lot of time talking to 8-year-olds. Are you the Army? She asked. Something like that, he said. She considered this. My dad's smarter than Army people, she said, with the easy certainty of someone stating a known fact. Bauer looked at Ethan. Something passed through his face. Not quite amusement, more like the involuntary response of a man who had just had something accurate said to him in an unexpected way. "Yeah," Bauer said. "He is." Ethan shifted Ava's weight against his shoulder and walked to the truck that Charlotte's assistant had brought around to the front lot. He buckled Ava into the back seat. She was mostly asleep before he'd closed the door. He sat behind the wheel for a moment and looked at the factory building, the lit windows of the admin block, the yellow glow from the production floor skylights, the Harrow Industrial sign clean and corporate against the darkening sky. He thought about Charlotte's face when she'd moved the laptop from the couch. The care in it. The way she'd done it without being asked, without making anything of it. He started the truck and pulled out of the lot. Charlotte was still in the plant at 9:30 p.m. when Marcus found her standing at the Line 3 bay, watching the machine run at half load with the focused expression of a person listening for something specific. "Sounds clean," he said. "It does," she said. "It really does." They stood together for a moment, listening to the machine do what it was supposed to do, which it was doing with a smoothness that it had not had in weeks, possibly months. Ethan's adjustments over the past year had been compensating for the underlying problem, which had meant the machine worked but never quite perfectly. Now it was running in a way that Charlotte realized, listening to it, she had never actually heard before. "He gave me a list," she said, "of things he's been quietly compensating for. I asked him before he left." Marcus was quiet, waiting. "It's 17 items," Charlotte said, "across all 3 lines. Some of them are small. 3 of them are not small." She paused. One of them, if it had progressed without intervention, would have caused a line 2 failure that we probably would have attributed to the equipment supplier and spent 8 months in arbitration over. Marcus said nothing. He'd worked here for 20 years and he didn't really have words for the particular feeling this produced. Something between gratitude and shame, and the slightly sick recognition of how differently things could have gone. "I owe you an apology too," Charlotte said, "for the Farwell situation. I've been using his institutional capital as a reason not to deal with a problem I should have dealt with. That ends." Marcus looked at her. "Okay," he said. "I mean it." "I know you do," he said. "That's why I said okay, instead of something less polite." Charlotte almost laughed. It came out as a short, surprised exhale, the kind of laugh that arrives before you've decided to have it. She covered it by looking back at the machine. "He's coming in tomorrow at 9, she said. "You're offering him his job back?" "I'm offering him something," she said. "I don't know exactly what yet. I need to think about it tonight." She paused. "I also need to think about what I'm going to say to the floor tomorrow, about today." Marcus looked at her sideways. "You could say nothing. People would let it go." "I know they would," Charlotte said. "That's not the point." Marcus nodded slowly. He'd worked for a lot of managers over 20 years, and one of the things you learned after long enough was that the good ones were distinguished less by the decisions they made when things were easy than by what they did after the decisions they got wrong. It wasn't a flashy quality. It didn't show up in performance reviews. But it mattered. "Go home," he said. "The machine's running." Charlotte looked at the floor one more time. The running machines, the late shift moving through their rhythms, the ordinary, essential business of 431 people keeping something going. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." She picked up her bag and her jacket. At the door, she stopped. "Marcus," she said. "The photograph in his locker, the one of his daughter. Do you know if he took it when he left this morning?" Marcus thought about it. "I think he did. He had it in his hand when he walked out." Charlotte nodded. She pushed open the door. Outside, the parking lot was cold and nearly empty, and the Pennsylvania sky had the particular deep darkness of early spring nights, and somewhere 4 miles away, a man with a doctorate and a classified history and a 7-year-old truck was making grilled cheese for his daughter, who had told a military officer that her father was smarter than Army people, which was the kind of thing that settled into you and stayed there. Charlotte sat in her car for a moment before starting it. She had been wrong about a lot of things today. She was trying to decide whether the acknowledgement of that, the actual full-weight acknowledgement, made the day better or worse. She suspected it made it both, and that was something she was going to have to learn to sit with. She started the car and drove home in the dark. He showed up at 9 o'clock exactly. Charlotte had been in the building since 7, which was unusual for her. She was an 8 o'clock person, had always been an 8 o'clock person, and arriving earlier felt like conceding something to anxiety that she didn't want to concede. But she hadn't slept well, and at 6:30 she'd given up pretending she was going to, made coffee, and driven in while the parking lot was still mostly empty and the plant was running the tail end of the night shift with a quietness that felt almost foreign compared to the previous afternoon. She'd spent the early hours doing 2 things. First, she'd walked the production floor, all 3 lines, with Marcus's 17-item list in her hand, going through each item with the kind of attention she should have been giving all along. Some of them she could assess herself. Others she couldn't, not without engineering expertise she didn't have, and those she'd marked with notes for follow-up. By 7:45, she had a clearer picture of the operational state of her own plant than she'd had in the 14 months she'd been running it, and the picture was both better and worse than she'd expected. Better because the plant was genuinely functional, and much of Ethan's quiet work had kept it that way. Worse because she now understood how load-bearing that quiet work had been and how invisible she'd allowed it to remain. The second thing she'd done was draft 3 different versions of what she was going to say to the floor that morning. She deleted all 3. The problem with drafting was that it made things sound prepared, and prepared had a way of landing hollow when what was actually called for was honest. She decided to just say the thing. She'd called an all-floor meeting for 8:15 a.m., before the day shift was fully into its rhythm. 412 people had gathered. The remaining 19 were on essential monitoring duties that couldn't be vacated. In the main floor area near the Line 2 bay, which was the largest open space in the building. They stood in the loose, slightly wary configuration of a workforce that had been called together unexpectedly and didn't yet know whether this was good news or bad. Charlotte stood in front of them without notes. "Yesterday," she said, "I made a mistake that affected this company and affected one of your colleagues. I want to address it directly." She paused, not for effect, but because she was choosing words carefully while also trying not to let the choosing show. "I terminated Ethan Walker based on documentation of procedural violations that were technically accurate and operationally wrong. He was operating outside established procedure. He was also, as many of you know better than I did, keeping this plant running in ways that our official systems weren't capturing. I acted on what I could document without adequately understanding what I couldn't." The floor was very quiet. This kind of quiet, 400 people in a large industrial space, had a specific texture, a held breath quality. "What followed is something most of you witnessed," she continued. "Line 3 failed. The contract deadline was at risk. Ethan came back, not because I asked him back in any way that he was obligated to respond to, but because he understood what was at stake for the people working here. He repaired the line. The contract is secure." She looked out at the faces in front of her, the older guys with crossed arms who'd been here 20 years, the younger workers who were still deciding how they felt about her, the women on the Line 3 crew who had watched the whole thing unfold the previous morning and whose expressions now were carefully neutral. "I was wrong. I've told him that. I'm telling you because you were here for it, and you deserve to know that it's been acknowledged." She stopped there. She didn't add caveats or procedural context or forward-looking action items. She just stopped. The quiet held for another second, and then it released, not into applause or any dramatic response, but into the ordinary sounds of people shifting their weight and exchanging glances and absorbing something. And Marcus, standing to one side, gave her a look that was brief and not elaborated and meant enough. She'd dismissed the meeting and gone upstairs to wait. Ethan knocked on the open office door at 9:01. He was in clean clothes, dark jeans, a worn flannel over a gray shirt, and he looked more rested than he had any right to look given yesterday, though the tiredness was still there around the edges. He was carrying a paper coffee cup from the place on Route 15 that Charlotte had noticed several of the floor workers patronized, but had never stopped at herself. He sat down across from her desk without being invited to, which was not rudeness. It was the ease of someone who had, apparently, decided to stop performing deference that he didn't actually feel. "I heard you talk to the floor," he said. "News travels." "Marcus texted me at 8:17, he said. "Of course he did." She folded her hands on the desk. "I want to offer you a position." Ethan drank his coffee and waited. "Not your old position," she said. That's not what I'm talking about. I want to create a senior engineering role, director of plant engineering, or something in that category. We can work out the title. Full authority over maintenance operations across all 3 lines, direct reporting to me, no work order bureaucracy. You build the protocols from the ground up based on what actually makes this plant work. She paused. Salary would be commensurate with the actual level of expertise you'd be bringing, which is not what you were being paid. She named a number. Ethan looked at the middle distance for a moment in the way he did when he was running something through his head. That's a significant increase, he said. It's what the job is worth, she said. Not what I can get away with paying. He was quiet. She'd expected some version of this quiet. She'd read him well enough by now to know that he didn't respond to things before he'd actually thought about them, which was unusual, and which she found, if she was honest, slightly unnerving in the specific way that encountering a habit better than your own is unnerving. The schedule flexibility, he said. I need to be able to get Ava at 3:15. Non-negotiable for you, I assume. Non-negotiable for me. Then it's not negotiable, Charlotte said. I don't care what the role is called or what the salary says, Matt. If you need to be somewhere at 3:15, you're somewhere at 3:15. We'll build the rest around that. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not suspicion, something more like the careful attention of a person who'd been surprised before and was taking a moment to verify the surprise was real. I want to fix the work order system first, he said, before I take any kind of formal role. What do you mean? The system isn't the problem. The problem is nobody trusts it because it's never produced results worth trusting. Reports go in and die. People stop reporting. He held up a hand before she could respond. I'm not talking about myself specifically. I'm talking about a pattern. Marcus has filed 6 maintenance escalations in the past year that went nowhere. Darren Cole documented a coolant contamination issue on line 1 in November that still hasn't been formally addressed. There's a junior technician on line 3, name is Priya Ramesh, who writes better diagnostic notes than most engineers I've met and who has been passed over for every advancement opportunity in 2 years, for reasons I cannot identify other than the fact that she's quiet and doesn't push. Charlotte was writing now. She'd picked up a pen without thinking about it, which was something she did when she was actually engaged rather than managing. So the system reform comes first, she said. It doesn't have to be first, Ethan said, but it has to be real. I'm not interested in taking a title that puts me above a process that still doesn't work. The people on that floor have been doing their jobs well enough. The infrastructure around them is what's failing. He paused. Present company included, the last 2 days notwithstanding. He said the last part without heat. Just a fact. Laid down. Present company included, Charlotte agreed. Something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. There was no moment, no significant pause. It was more like the small mechanical click of 2 things finding alignment after being slightly off for a while. I'll need to look at Priya Ramesh's file, Charlotte said. You should. And I want you to walk me through the 17 items on the list in person. Not by email. I want to understand each one. That'll take a few hours? I have a few hours, she said. I'm going to block Thursday afternoon, if that works for you. Thursday works, he said. She wrote it down. Then she looked up and said something she hadn't planned to say, that arrived without the preparation she usually gave things before she said them. What you said yesterday, about your daughter's play, the one you missed. Ethan went still, not defensive, but careful. I'm sorry, she said. That's all. I'm sorry that happened. He looked at her for a long moment. The sunlight through the office window had moved to a different angle since he'd sat down, and it caught the side of his face in a way that made the tiredness visible again, not as weakness, but as the legitimate mark of carrying something heavy for a long time. She doesn't remember it, he said, or she says she doesn't. Do you believe her? No, he said, quietly. But she says it like she means it, so maybe she's decided to let it go. She's better at that than I am. Charlotte looked down at her desk for a moment. I'll see you Thursday, he said, standing. Thursday, she said. He picked up his coffee cup and walked out. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, the unhurried, even pace of them, and then the floor below, and then nothing. She sat for a moment. Outside the window, Line 3 was running at full production load, smooth and steady, and the sound of it came up through the floor in a low, constant vibration that she'd stopped noticing weeks ago, but that she noticed now. 400 people's livelihoods running on the other side of that glass, kept running by a man who had chosen, out of some combination of loyalty and practicality and something she didn't have a clean word for yet, to be exactly where he was. She put her pen down and got back to work. Chick. The Thursday afternoon walkthrough lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. They started at line 1, at the coolant contamination issue that Darren had documented in November. Charlotte had pulled the original report before they started, had read it, and had the particular expression of someone confronting evidence of a failure they can't undo but can document. The contamination issue had resolved on its own, or appeared to have, but Ethan walked her through why that resolution was temporary, what the actual source was, and what a proper fix required, which was a $40 component replacement and about 2 hours of work that would have taken 30 minutes to authorize if the report had gone anywhere. $40, Charlotte said. And 2 hours of labor, Ethan said. That's a $50,000 production disruption waiting to happen for a $40 fix. That's most of what's on the list, he said. Not the scale, necessarily, the principle. They moved through the 17 items with Charlotte asking questions and Ethan answering them in the direct technical way he had. Not simplified, but not padded, either. He explained what she needed to understand without condescending and without assuming she already knew. Charlotte had spent enough time with engineers to recognize that this calibration was harder than it looked, and most people didn't hit it naturally. Priya Ramesh was working the Line 3 station when they passed through. She was small, probably 26 or 27, with the focused economy of someone who'd learned to take up less space than she deserved. She glanced up when Charlotte and Ethan approached, with the slightly braced expression of a junior employee who's been noticed by the CEO and doesn't know what it means. Priya, Ethan said, the harmonic data you've been logging on the secondary drive, can you show Charlotte what you've been tracking? Priya looked between them. Now? If you have a minute? She pulled up a tablet. What she showed Charlotte was a 6-week trend analysis of the drive harmonics, documented in her own time, cross-referenced with production load data and ambient temperature readings, with a written hypothesis about what the pattern indicated. It was, Charlotte recognized immediately, excellent work. Not good for a tech work. Actually excellent. The kind of analysis she'd expect from a degreed engineer with real experience. How long have you been doing this? Charlotte asked. Priya glanced at Ethan, then back. About 8 months? Have you submitted it anywhere? I sent it to my floor supervisor in December. A pause that said everything. I didn't hear back. Charlotte wrote the supervisor's name in her notebook. She asked Priya 2 more questions. Specific, technical questions, not the performative kind, and Priya answered them without hedging. She knew her work. After they moved on, Charlotte said, she should be in an engineering development track. Yes, Ethan said. She should have been a year ago. Why wasn't she? Ethan was quiet for a second. Some of it is the system. Some of it is that the floor supervisor she reports to isn't good at recognizing work he doesn't already understand. And some of it is probably... He paused again. I don't know. I don't want to speculate about what I can't verify. Charlotte looked at him. You do know. You just don't want to say it. She's the only South Asian woman on the production floor, he said. Her supervisor has made comments in passing that I've heard twice. Nothing formal, nothing I could write up as policy. But it's there. Charlotte closed her notebook. She held it at her side. Her expression had the particular flatness of someone containing something that would not be productive to release in this context. I'll handle it, she said. I know you will, he said. I wouldn't have brought it up if I didn't think so. They stood in the Line 3 bay for a moment. The machine ran around them, clean and even, and Priya had gone back to her station and was working with the concentrated patience of someone who'd learned not to expect things and was therefore not spending energy hoping. When does Ava get out of school? Charlotte asked. 3:15. She checked her watch. It was 3:08. Go, she said. Ethan looked at the remaining 2 items on the list. They can wait, she said. Go get your kid. Something crossed his face. Quick, barely visible. But there. He picked up his jacket. "I'll send you the notes on the last two by tonight," he said. "Don't. Send them tomorrow. Have dinner." He looked at her with a slight expression of someone who wasn't sure what to do with that, and she realized it sounded more personal than she'd intended, and they both registered that register and neither acknowledged it. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she confirmed and turned back to the machine. The weeks that followed were not clean or easy, which was appropriate, because the fixing of institutional problems rarely is. Charlotte restructured the work order escalation system, which took 3 weeks and produced 2 resignations from middle management, one expected, one that surprised her, and a significant amount of friction from Richard Farwell, who had operated for 20 years on the understanding that procedures existed primarily to give him cover and had not yet adjusted to an environment where they existed to actually work. She'd had 2 direct, uncomfortable conversations with Farwell, and after the second one, she'd accepted his early retirement offer with a letter that was professional and warm and final. She put Priya Ramesh into the engineering development track. She also, quietly, began building a documentation trail on the supervisor who'd buried Priya's reports, and she was methodical about it because institutional bias was the kind of thing you had to be methodical about if you wanted to do it right rather than just visibly. Ethan formally took the director of plan engineering role in the 4th week. He didn't change anything about how he operated, not really. He still arrived early and worked with his hands and moved through the plant with the particular attention of someone who's listening to the building. But there was a difference now, a structural recognition that his work was connected to the official systems instead of existing around them. He started the process of writing actual documentation for the maintenance practices he'd developed over 7 years, which was slow because the knowledge was partly procedural and partly the kind of thing that lived in the body and resisted language. But he worked at it steadily. He and Charlotte developed a working relationship that operated in short, dense conversations. Before shift meetings, over coffee in the break room that she started using instead of the one in the executive suite, on the production floor while they were both looking at something that needed attention. The conversations had a particular efficiency. They didn't talk around things, and they didn't perform agreement, and when they disagreed, which happened, they said so without making it an event. He disagreed with her about the line 2 speed increase she'd proposed to hit a Q2 target. He told her the mechanical stress profile didn't support it, and showed her why. She pushed back. The numbers were real, the target was real. And he let her push back without retreating, and then they looked at the data together for 40 minutes, and she modified the proposal. Not fully his way or fully hers. A version that was better than either. He told her later in an offhand way that it was the first time in 7 years he'd been in a room where someone actually looked at the data with him instead of around it. Charlotte wasn't sure how to respond to that. She said, "That's a depressingly low bar." "It is," he said. "But here we are." She laughed. A real one, not the short exhale from before. It surprised her, and it surprised him slightly, and neither of them made anything of it. What? In the 5th week, Ava came to the plant again. Not because of an emergency this time. Ethan had a late meeting with a vendor that ran over, and the after-school program at Northbrook had a schedule conflict, and Ava arrived at 4:45 with her backpack and the calm adaptability of a child who had spent her life figuring out the logistics of being raised by a single parent. Charlotte's assistant met her at the entrance and walked her up. Charlotte was passing through the administrative corridor when she saw Ava sitting in the small waiting area outside her office, doing homework on the coffee table with the focused efficiency of someone trying to get it out of the way. "Hey," Charlotte said. Ava looked up. She had her father's steadiness in her face, that particular quality of unhurried assessment. "Hi. Sorry for the inconvenience." Charlotte stopped. "Did someone tell you to say that?" "My dad said to apologize for any inconvenience." "You're not an inconvenience," Charlotte said. She hesitated for a second, which was unusual for her, and then said, "Do you want to come see the floor?" Ava looked at the homework, then at Charlotte, then at the homework. "My dad said I have to finish the math before I do anything else." "How much math?" "1 page of fractions." "How are you at fractions?" "Okay," Ava said. "I don't like them." "Nobody likes them," Charlotte said. "Do the page and then I'll show you the floor." She paused. "I'm better at fractions than you'd expect." Ava looked at her with a slight squint of evaluation. Why would I expect you to be bad at fractions? I don't know, Charlotte said. Why would you? Ava considered this. I wouldn't, I guess, she said, and went back to her homework. Charlotte went back to her office and sat at her desk and found, for reasons she didn't examine, that she was smiling at something. Ava finished the math in 19 minutes and presented herself at Charlotte's office door with her backpack over one shoulder. Charlotte walked her down to the floor. She took her to line 2 first, because it was currently running the quieter of the production cycles, and you could stand near it without needing ear protection. She explained what it made, the agricultural components, the way the raw steel blanks came in, and the finished parts came out. And Ava listened with real attention, asking questions that were precise and a little unexpected. How do you know if it's wrong? Ava asked, watching the cutting station cycle. The machine tells you, Charlotte said. There are sensors that measure everything. If something's off, an alert fires. But my dad finds things before the alert fires, Ava said. Matter of fact. No pride in it, just observation. Charlotte looked at her. How do you know that? Ava shrugged. He talks about it. Not a lot, but sometimes. He says the machines tell you things before the sensors do. You just have to listen in a different way. She paused. I don't totally understand what that means. I don't either, Charlotte said honestly. Ava seemed to find this acceptable. They walked along the line 2 bay, and Ava pointed at things and asked questions, and Charlotte answered them when she could and said, I don't know. Ask your father when she couldn't, and it was a different kind of conversation than Charlotte usually had in this building. Slower, more lateral, less concerned with outcomes. They were near the end of the line 3 bay when Ethan appeared from the direction of the conference room, his meeting apparently finished. He stopped when he saw them together. His expression went through something brief and not fully nameable, and then he came over. Math? He said to Ava. Done, she said. All of it? All of it. She held up her notebook as evidence. He looked at Charlotte. I hope she wasn't... She was fine, Charlotte said. She's been teaching me things about how you work. Ethan looked at Ava, who had the expression of someone who could not be held responsible for other people's conversation choices. I said the thing about listening to the machines, Ava said. She said she didn't understand it either. It's hard to explain, Ethan said. I know, Ava said. You always say that. There was a pause that was comfortable in a way that surprised all 3 of them slightly. The way comfortable pauses sometimes do when they arrive before you've expected them. We should head out, Ethan said. Yeah, Charlotte said. Ava had already put her notebook back in her backpack and was looking around the floor with the quiet satisfaction of a person who'd gotten what they came for. She looked back at Charlotte. Thanks for the floor thing, she said. Any time, Charlotte said, and meant it. She watched them walk toward the exit, Ethan's hand briefly on Ava's shoulder, steering her around a pallet jack that was moving in their path, the easy physical shorthand of 2 people who knew each other's movement. And she stood for a moment in the middle of the production floor with the machines running around her and something sitting in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet, warm and slightly inconvenient, the kind of feeling that arrives before you've decided whether you want it. She turned back toward her office and got on with the rest of her day. The thing about changing how you see someone is that it doesn't happen in a single moment, no matter how much the mind prefers that version of events. It happens in accumulation, small moments stacking on top of each other until one day you notice the weight of them and realize they've been building for longer than you thought. For Charlotte, it was not the repair, though the repair mattered. It was not the 17-item list, though that had rearranged something fundamental in how she understood her own plant. It was not even the floor meeting, though standing in front of 400 people and saying I was wrong without cushioning it had cost her something real and left something else in its place. It was smaller than any of that. It was a Tuesday morning in the 7th week, before the day shift started, when she'd come down to the floor to look at a vibration pattern on line 1 that Ethan had flagged in an email the night before. He was already there. Of course, he was already there. He was always there before anyone had a reason to be, crouched beside the lower drive housing with a contact gauge in his hand. He wasn't aware she'd come down yet. She stood back for a moment, not intentionally, just because she'd come around the end of the line and stopped when she saw him, and didn't immediately announce herself. He was talking to Darren Cole, who was crouched beside him, And what he was saying was not a directive and not an explanation. It was more like thinking out loud, the way a person talks when they're genuinely working through something and happen to have someone next to them. He was pointing at something on the housing and saying, "The frequency is consistent, but the amplitude varies with temperature, which means it's not a bearing defect. It's thermal expansion in the mount. You see how the clearance changes here between morning and midday?" And Darren was leaning in with the posture of someone actually learning something, not performing attention but having it, and nodding in the specific way people nod when a thing they'd suspected but couldn't articulate has just been given language. Charlotte had worked with a lot of smart people. She'd worked with people who were technically brilliant and interpersonally brutal, people who hoarded knowledge because sharing it diluted their value, people who explained things in ways that made the listener feel small so the explainer could feel large. She'd learned to navigate all of them. What Ethan was doing with Darren was different from any of that. He was just giving it away. The knowledge, the method, the way of looking, without calculation, without keeping score. She walked back around the line and came toward them from a different angle, making enough noise that they heard her coming. When she reached them, Darren had straightened up and Ethan was still crouched, looking at the gauge. "Thermal expansion in the mount," she said. Ethan looked up. "You got the email." "I got the email. What do you need?" "New isolation pads on the mount points. We've got 2 in inventory, but I need 4. I can run it on 2 for a week without significant risk if the order comes in before then." "I'll have it in by Thursday," she said. "Thursday works," he said, and went back to the gauge. She stood there for a second longer than she needed to. Darren glanced at her and then away, with the instinctive tact of someone who'd noticed something he hadn't been meant to see. Charlotte turned and went upstairs. That was when it started, though she wouldn't have called it that yet. She would have called it noticing. She was good at noticing. It was the thing that made her good at her job. And she had started noticing Ethan Walker the way she'd noticed the first operational irregularity on Line 2 all those months ago. Something that didn't fit the framework she'd walked in with. Something worth paying attention to. She paid attention, and she tried not to make anything of it, and she was mostly unsuccessful. The isolation pads came in Wednesday. Ethan installed them Thursday morning before she arrived. When Charlotte came in at 8, the Line 1 vibration issue was in the past tense. She found a note on her desk, an actual handwritten note on a piece of paper, which was such an anachronism in the context of the plant's communication systems that it stopped her for a second. Line 1 resolved. Thermal expansion compensated. Should hold through summer. EW, she kept the note. She put it in the middle drawer of her desk rather than recycling it, and she was aware that she was doing this, and she told herself it was because it was relevant documentation and then acknowledged to herself that that was not the reason. The board meeting in the 8th week nearly undid everything. Harrow's board of directors met quarterly, and this quarter's meeting was the one where Charlotte was to present the operational results and the preliminary acquisition discussion with the private equity firm that had been circling. The meeting was in Philadelphia, a 2-hour drive, in a conference room that had the expensive neutrality of corporate spaces designed to make every decision feel equally weighted. Charlotte had spent a week preparing. The numbers were good, the best quarterly numbers the plant had produced in 3 years, with the Line 3 contract secured, the cycle time improvements holding, and several efficiency gains from the structural changes she'd implemented. She knew the numbers well and she knew how to present them, and she walked in feeling as prepared as she'd ever felt walking into a board meeting. What she hadn't fully anticipated was Gerald Harrow. Gerald was 81, the founder's son, and held 22% of the company's voting stock. He'd had no operational role in the company for 12 years, but board meetings were the venue where his historical authority still had traction, and he exercised it selectively and with the particular confidence of a man who'd never been fully accountable for the outcomes of his opinions. He waited until Charlotte had finished her presentation and the preliminary acquisition discussion had gone through its first round, and then he asked about the termination and rehire of the engineering director. He'd gotten the story clearly, but not the full version. He had the version where the CEO had made an abrupt and damaging personnel decision that had jeopardized a major contract and required emergency intervention by military stakeholders, and he had that version without the context of what had come before it or after it. And he used it the way people use stories when they want to make a structural point about something else. "My concern," Gerald said, with the measured cadence of a man who had spent decades making concerns sound like objective observations, is the decision-making framework that produced that outcome. The acquisition discussion assumes a stable, well-managed operation. What we have documented is an incident in which a C-suite decision nearly destroyed a significant contract and required 3 military helicopters and a terminated employee to resolve. Charlotte looked at him. That's an accurate description of the incident. And the executive who made the decision is still in this room, Charlotte said. I made the call. I've addressed it directly, with the company and with the individual involved. The structural issues that contributed to it have been identified and corrected. The structural issues, Gerald repeated. There was a maintenance escalation pipeline that didn't work. There was a reporting system that buried information. There was an HR file that didn't reflect what an employee was actually doing or who he actually was. She paused. And there was a CEO who diagnosed a compliance problem without adequately understanding the operational context. I corrected all of those, including the last one. Gerald looked at her for a moment. 2 other board members were watching the exchange with the careful neutrality of people who hadn't decided which way it was going. You're defending your own error, Gerald said. I'm explaining the response to it, Charlotte said. There's a difference. The error was real. The correction was also real. The plant is in better operational shape today than it was before the incident, partly because the incident forced us to look at things we'd been missing. She held his gaze. If you want to make a case against me based on the incident, you have the facts. If you want to evaluate the quarter, those numbers are on the screen behind me and they're not ambiguous. The room was quiet. Gerald looked at the numbers. He looked at Charlotte. He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. And then he asked a question about Q3 projections that shifted the conversation, and the moment passed. Charlotte drove back to Allenwood in the dark, 2 hours of Pennsylvania highway, and she ran the conversation through her head the whole way. Not obsessively. She didn't relitigate things she couldn't change, but with the honest assessment she applied to everything. She'd held. She'd said true things. The board had moved on. The acquisition discussion was still alive. She also knew that she had defended her own mistake in a room full of people who expected her not to have made it, and that defending it had required using Ethan's name, his background, his return to the plant, all of it leveraged as justification for a decision she'd gotten wrong. She called him when she was 40 minutes from the plant, not for a particular reason. She told herself she was checking on an overnight production issue that Marcus had mentioned that morning, which was real but not urgent. He answered on the 3rd ring with the sound of a kitchen behind him, running water, something on a stove. How was the board? He asked, which meant Marcus had mentioned it. Fine, she said. They have the acquisition numbers, and they like them. Good. There was some friction about March, she paused. I had to use the specifics of what happened to defend the response to it. A brief silence. Okay, he said. Not a loaded okay. Just the acknowledgement of a fact. I wanted you to know, she said. I used your name, your background, the military piece. I thought you should know that's part of the board record now. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him move something off the stove. Does it matter? He asked. To you, I mean. Does it change the situation? No, she said. I didn't want to do it without you knowing. Another pause, longer this time. That's decent of you, he said. The simplicity of it landed in a way that more elaborate responses wouldn't have. How's Ava? She hadn't planned to ask that either. It came out the way things come out when you've stopped monitoring the conversation and are just having it. Asleep, he said. She had a swim meet today. She came in 3rd in the 50 free. That's good? For a second-year swimmer, yeah, it's pretty good. A pause. She was annoyed. She wanted to win. She sounds like you, Charlotte said, and then wondered if that was too much. Probably, he said, without apparent concern about whether it was too much. Drive safe. She said she would. She put the phone in the cup holder and drove the last 40 minutes in the dark with the heater running and something quiet and warm sitting in her chest that she'd been trying to name for 3 weeks and still hadn't managed. The thing she hadn't expected about Ethan Walker was that he was funny. Not performing funny, not the kind of humor people deploy strategically in professional environments to make themselves more likable. It was drier than that, and quieter, the kind that appeared occasionally in the middle of otherwise practical conversations and was gone before you'd quite decided how to respond to it. In the 9th week, they were in a vendor meeting with a components supplier who had come in with a pitch for a premium bearing line that would, the salesman explained with significant enthusiasm, deliver 15% better longevity and a 20% reduction in maintenance frequency across all 3 production lines. The pitch was slick and the numbers were presented attractively, and the salesman had a way of talking that filled the room with confident energy. Ethan sat across the table and listened to the whole thing without expression. When the salesman finished, he asked 3 technical questions. Specific, unglamorous questions about metallurgical composition and load tolerance and the testing methodology behind the longevity claims. And the salesman's confident energy deflated in real time as it became clear that the answers were either unavailable or less supportive of the claims than the pitch had suggested. After the vendor left, Charlotte and Ethan sat in the conference room for a moment. "He was enthusiastic," Charlotte said. "He was," Ethan said. "Very." "The longevity numbers were extrapolated from controlled test conditions that don't resemble our operating environment." He paused. "He had good visual materials, though." "The animated bearing diagram was impressive," Charlotte said. "It really was," Ethan said. "I almost wanted to buy something just for the animation." Charlotte laughed. "The real one. The one that arrived before she decided to have it. It had been happening more frequently, and she'd noticed, and she suspected he had too." He stood up to leave and said, without looking back, "I'll send you 3 alternative suppliers by end of week. Their marketing is significantly less cinematic." "That's a sacrifice I'm willing to make," she said. The door closed and she sat in the empty conference room with the smile still on her face, just for a second, before she collected herself and went back to work. The question of what this was, what they were doing in the margins of the professional structure they'd built, did not announce itself clearly. That was the nature of it. It existed in the accumulation, the morning coffees that had started happening by coincidence on the same schedule and had stopped being coincidence somewhere around week 6. The conversations that started as operational and ended somewhere else. The way she'd started taking the back stairs to the floor because it went past the workshop where he spent his mornings. And the way she'd noticed herself doing this and had not stopped. She was not naive about her own emotional life. She'd had relationships, 2 significant ones, one in her late 20s that had ended with mutual exhaustion when both parties realized they'd been more committed to the idea of the relationship than to each other, one shorter and less serious that had dissolved without drama. She was 30 years old and she knew what it felt like when she was interested in someone. She also knew, with the operational clarity she applied to most things, all the reasons this was complicated. He was her employee. That was real, and it mattered. He was a widower with a child whose life had been structured, at significant personal cost, around a specific kind of stability. She was aware of what that meant, that the thing he'd built wasn't casual, couldn't be treated as casual, and that if she was wrong about what she was reading in the mornings in the stairwells and the vendor meetings, the cost of being wrong wouldn't be only hers. She was also aware, with the honesty she'd earned over several weeks of paying attention, that she wasn't wrong. The question was what to do with that. She didn't do anything, for a while. She let the structure they had keep doing what it was doing. The work was real. The collaboration was real. The thing they'd built together out of the wreckage of March was real. And she watched it and tried to read it accurately. Boy, in the 10th week, Marcus's wife had a baby. It was a Thursday, early, unexpected by 3 weeks. A slightly panicked text from Marcus to Charlotte at 6 a.m. saying he wouldn't be in. Charlotte replied with exactly what the situation required and then organized the day shift coverage, which was not complicated because the plant had developed over the previous 2 months, the kind of operational stability where a single absence didn't create a cascade. She mentioned it to Ethan when he came in at 7:47. He said, "Is she okay?" "Both of them are fine. Boy, 6 pounds 4 ounces. He nodded. He was looking at the line 2 data on his tablet, but he stopped looking at it for a moment. "Marcus has been here a long time," he said. "He deserves a good week." "I told him to take 2. "He'll take 3 days and come back," Ethan said. "He won't be able to help it." He was right. Marcus came back on day 4 looking simultaneously exhausted and incandescent in the way new fathers do, and he spent the first hour showing phone photos to anyone who stood still long enough. And Ethan looked at the photos with the genuine attention of someone who knew what this particular state of a person's life felt like. Charlotte watched him look at the photos of Marcus's son, and she watched the expression on his face. Not sentimentality, not performance, just a person recognizing something they knew. And something in her chest did the thing it had been doing with increasing frequency, that unnamed warm pressure that she'd been calling noticing because she hadn't let herself call it anything else. Later that afternoon, she was in her office when he knocked on the open door. He had a folder in his hand, the quarterly maintenance documentation she'd asked for. "You have a minute?" he said. "Come in." He sat across the desk and they went through the documentation, and it was efficient and useful and entirely professional, and she was aware, the entire time, of the specific quality of the air in the room when it was just the two of them, the way the conversation breathed differently. When they'd finished, he didn't immediately stand up. He sat for a moment with the folder in his hands, looking at the desk surface, in the way he looked when he was working something out. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "The board meeting. The acquisition." He looked up. "If the acquisition goes through, what happens to the plant?" Charlotte was still. "Why?" "I need to know if it's a real question or a diplomatic one." She looked at him. "It's a real question," she said. "I don't know yet. The PE firm has signaled they want to maintain operations, but that's a standard signal and it doesn't bind them to anything post-close. It depends on the structure of the deal." "And the people?" "Yes," she said. "The people are the question. They always are in these situations." He was quiet for a moment. "I need to know if I'm building something here or stabilizing something that's going to be dismantled," he said. "I have people on this floor who are making career decisions based on this place having a future. Priya turned down a lateral move to another company last month. Darren is in night school because he thinks there's a path forward here." Charlotte looked at him. The light in the office was the late afternoon kind, long and slightly warm, and it caught the side of his face in the way it had that day in March when he'd told her about Ava's play. "I'm not going to recommend a deal structure that dismantles this," she said. "That's not a promise that binds the board or the buyer. But it's what I'm going to recommend, and I'm going to make the case, and it'll be part of any term sheet I sign off on." "Okay," he said. "Is that enough?" He thought about it honestly, which was what he did. Didn't perform acceptance, actually considered it. "It's enough for now," he said. "Thank you for the straight answer." "I don't usually give other kinds," she said. "I know," he said. "It's one of the things—" He stopped. The pause held for a second. "One of the things?" she said. He looked at her with the steady, careful attention he gave things when he was being precise. "One of the things I've come to appreciate about working with you," he said. He stood up. "I'll have the Q3 framework to you by Friday." He walked out. Charlotte sat at her desk in the afternoon light and did not move for a longer moment than she would have admitted to. And outside the window, the floor ran its steady, vital rhythm. And somewhere down there, 400 people were doing their work in a plant that had been changed, month by month and conversation by conversation, into something it hadn't been before. Not because of the numbers, though the numbers were real, but because of what happened when two people who were both, in their different ways, more accustomed to doing things alone started, slowly and without ceremony, doing something together. She picked up the quarterly documentation folder and got back to work. But she was smiling. It was Ava who finally said the thing that nobody else in the situation had managed to say. She'd come to the plant on a Friday in the 11th week. Scheduled this time, Ethan had a meeting with the new Line 3 engineering consultant that ran over, and Ava came straight from school and sat in the break room doing homework with a juice box Charlotte's assistant had sourced from somewhere. Charlotte came down at 5 to let Ethan know his consultant was waiting in the conference room, and she found Ava at the break room table with her homework packed away, drawing something in her sketchbook. "He's still in the meeting?" Charlotte asked. "He's always still in the meeting," Ava said without particular grievance. She looked up. "Do you want to see?" She showed Charlotte the drawing. It was the factory floor, rendered in pencil with the particular combination of inaccuracy and rightness that children's drawings have. The machines were approximate, the proportions were loose, but the overall feeling of the space was there. The long bays and the overhead lights and the sense of purposeful motion. "That's good," Charlotte said, and meant it. "I come here a lot now," Ava said. She said it as an observation, not a complaint. She added something to a corner of the drawing. "My dad likes it here. He likes it more than he used to, I think." Charlotte sat down across from her because it was either that or stand in the doorway, and standing in the doorway seemed wrong. "What do you mean?" Ava set down her pencil. She had the directness of her father, Basi I Shaiba, the same quality of saying things without first checking whether they were comfortable to say. He was happy at the old job, before. She paused. Then he wasn't happy for a long time. He was okay, but you can tell the difference. She looked at Charlotte with her father's steadiness. "He's better now, since here got better." Charlotte didn't say anything. She didn't have anything immediately available. "He talks about work stuff at dinner sometimes," Ava continued. "He didn't used to. He used to just ask me about school and not say anything about his day." She picked up the pencil again. "Now he says things like Charlotte thinks, and Charlotte said, and stuff like that." The break room was very quiet. "He's probably going to be embarrassed I said that," Ava said, with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has long since made peace with saying true things at suboptimal moments. "Probably," Charlotte agreed. Ava added a detail to the drawing. She didn't look up when she said, "He's been alone for a really long time. I think he forgot that it doesn't have to be that way." Charlotte looked at this 8-year-old child who had her father's eyes and her father's way of putting a thing down plainly and walking away from it, and she felt something move through her that was more complex and more certain than anything she'd felt in a very long time. "You're very perceptive," Charlotte said. "My teacher says that too," Ava said. "I think it mostly means I say things I'm not supposed to." "Not necessarily," Charlotte said. The door opened and Ethan came in, looking slightly apologetic. He looked at Ava, then at Charlotte, then back at Ava with the parental instinct of someone reading a room. "What did you say?" he said to Ava. "Nothing," Ava said, which was so transparently untrue that it didn't even require response. Ethan looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked back at him. The moment held its breath. "Ready to go?" he asked Ava. "Yep." She closed the sketchbook and stood up with the smooth, decisive motion of someone who has accomplished what they came to do. She picked up her backpack and her juice box and walked to the door. She stopped and looked back at Charlotte. "See you next time," she said. "See you next time," Charlotte said. Ethan held her gaze for one beat longer than the moment required. Something in it. Not an answer, not quite a question, more like an acknowledgement that a thing had been said in this room and that it was going to sit between them now in the not bad way that things sit between people when they've been named before they were ready. Then he followed his daughter out of the break room, and Charlotte sat at the table with the sketchbook drawing of the factory floor in front of her. And outside the window the plant ran its steady rhythm into the early evening, and she thought about what Ava had said. He forgot that it doesn't have to be that way. And she thought about herself, and whether she'd forgotten the same thing, and she thought the answer was probably yes. She sat with it for a while. Then she gathered her things and went back upstairs because there was still work to do, and the work was real, and tomorrow was another day in a place that had, without her entirely planning it, started to feel like somewhere that mattered. The acquisition offer came in on a Wednesday morning in early December, 47 pages of term sheet delivered by courier to Charlotte's office at 8:10 a.m., which was 10 minutes after she arrived and before she'd finished her first coffee. She read it twice. The first time quickly, moving through the structure to understand the architecture of what was being proposed. The second time slowly, with a pen, marking the sections that needed attention. By noon, she'd identified 7 points that required negotiation. 3 of them were about operational continuity clauses. 2 were about workforce retention. 1 was about the engineering development program she'd built with Ethan over the past 3 months, specifically whether it would survive a change in ownership or be rationalized away in the first post-acquisition cost review. The seventh point was the one she spent the most time on, which was a performance earnout clause that effectively made her continued role contingent on hitting financial targets that the buyer had structured in a way that created an incentive to cut investment in the plant's long-term health in order to hit short-term numbers. She underlined that one twice and wrote non-starter in the margin. She sent the marked-up term sheet to the company's M&A counsel with a cover note and then walked downstairs. Ethan was in the workshop at the back of the building, the space he'd taken over gradually over the preceding months, and which had, with his quiet occupation of it, become something between a laboratory and a library. Parts and tools organized in the specific way his mind organized things. Documentation he'd been building stacked in binders on a shelf he'd installed himself. A whiteboard covered in diagrams that Charlotte had stopped trying to fully decode and instead experienced as a kind of visual record of the plant's mechanical life. He was at the workbench with what appeared to be a prototype-bearing mount modification, working with a pair of precision calipers and the focused stillness she'd come to associate with him being entirely inside a problem. "The offer came in," she said from the doorway. He looked up. He read her expression the way he'd gotten better at reading her expressions, with the same careful attention he gave machines. "How bad?" "Not bad overall," she said. "There are 7 issues. I can win 5 of them in negotiation." She paused. 2 of them I might not win." He set the calipers down. "The workforce retention clause? That's one of the 5 I can win. They want it at 90 days. I'll get it to 18 months with penalty provisions." She came into the workshop and leaned against the bench across from him. "The earnout structure is the harder one. They've built it so the incentive runs against long-term investment. It's not unusual. It's actually standard for this kind of deal, but it means whoever's running this plant after close has a financial reason to harvest it rather than grow it." He was quiet, processing. "And the other one?" he said. She looked at him. "Your program. The engineering development track, the documentation project, the maintenance infrastructure we've built. They have it categorized as discretionary overhead in their preliminary model. It's not protected." The workshop was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the half-open door, the floor was doing its ordinary thing, the machinery, the voices, the constant productive sound of the place working. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to fight for both of them in negotiation," she said, "and I'm going to tell you that I might not win both, so you can make whatever decisions you need to make with the real information rather than the optimistic version." He looked at her for a long moment. This was the thing about Charlotte Hayes that had taken him a while to understand, and that he'd come to trust more than almost anything else about her. She didn't soften things to make them easier to hear. She gave you the real version and trusted you to handle it, which was a form of respect that was rarer than it should have been. "If they cut the program," he started, "then Priya's development track disappears. The documentation project stops. The mentorship pipeline we've been building—" She stopped. Exhaled. "I know what it means. I know who it affects." "It's not just the people it affects directly," he said. "It's what it signals to everyone else. That the things that actually make this place work are the first things that get cut when someone new comes in with a spreadsheet." He paused. "I've watched that happen before, at other places. It doesn't just hurt the people in the program, it changes what people believe is possible here." Charlotte nodded. She was writing nothing down because this wasn't a meeting. It was a conversation, and it mattered differently than meetings mattered. "I'll fight for it," she said again. "I want you to know that." "I know," he said. She picked up the prototype bearing mount from the bench and turned it in her hands without really looking at it. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "The earnout clause. The way it's structured, it also affects my role. They want me to stay on as CEO through the earnout period, which is 3 years, but the targets are designed in a way that would push me toward decisions I wouldn't otherwise make." She set the part back down. "I can push back on the structure. I might get them to modify it, or I can walk away from the deal entirely. The board has the right to reject the offer, and my recommendation carries significant weight." "What do you want to do?" The question landed simply. Not what does the board want, or what does the analysis say? What do you want? She'd asked herself the same question for the past 3 hours and had not fully answered it. "I want to know that whatever I decide isn't just about the deal," she said. That I'm not recommending rejection because she stopped, chose the words deliberately. I need to be sure I'm not conflating things that should stay separate. Ethan was still. He had the expression of someone who understood exactly what she was saying and was deciding whether to meet it directly or let it pass. She'd watched him make that calculation before. She knew what it looked like. I think, he said slowly, that the reasons a person makes a decision can be complicated without the decision being wrong. The workshop held the words for a moment. That's not a very clean principle, she said. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him. He looked back. Between them was the workbench and the prototype part and the afternoon light coming in through the high workshop window. And also 11 weeks of mornings and conversations and the particular thing that accumulates between two people when they've been through something real together and come out the other side changed. Ethan, she said. Yeah, he said. Just that, like he'd been waiting for his name. I need to ask you something directly, she said, because I'm not good at not being direct, and I think you know that by now. I know that, he said. What Ava said in the break room last week. He closed his eyes briefly. Yeah, I heard about that. She said you'd be embarrassed. She was right, he said. I am, a little. He looked at her steadily. But she wasn't wrong. The quiet that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet of something that had been approaching for a long time and had finally arrived and was just standing there waiting to be acknowledged. I don't want to make this more complicated than your life needs to be, Charlotte said. You've built something that works, you and Ava. I'm not interested in disrupting that. I know, he said, but the thing about a life that works, he paused, and the way he paused when he was finding the right precision for something. It can work and still have room in it. Those aren't in opposition. Charlotte looked at him. She was not a person who cried easily. She couldn't remember the last time she had, actually, but something in her chest was doing something adjacent to it. A pressure that was neither grief nor its opposite, but somewhere in the complicated territory between. I don't know how to do this carefully, she said. Neither do I, he said. I haven't, He stopped, tried again. It's been 3 years. I'm not smooth about any of this. I want you to know that going in. I don't need smooth, she said. Good, he said. Because what I have is complicated and slow, and I have a kid who will absolutely say things at the worst possible moments. Charlotte laughed. The real one. It broke something open in the room, and the something that broke was good. I know about the kid, she said. I like the kid. She likes you too, he said. She told me last week you explained fractions in a way that actually made sense. She told you that? She also said, and I'm quoting directly, that you seem like someone who has your life together, in some ways and not in others, which she finds relatable. Charlotte stared at him. She's 8, he said. She doesn't have a filter. She has your filter, Charlotte said, which is to say no filter, just very good aim. He smiled. A full one this time, not the almost smile or the corner of the mouth. The real thing, and it changed his face entirely, and she'd seen glimpses of it before, but not like this, not unguarded and unhurried. Yeah, he said. That's fair. They stood in the workshop in the December afternoon, and the factory ran around them, and nothing was resolved or finished or clean, because nothing real ever is at the beginning, but something had been said, and saying it had made it solid, and solid things could be built on. The negotiation with the acquiring firm took 3 weeks. Charlotte went into it with the marked-up term sheet and the M&A counsel and a clear understanding of what she would accept and what she wouldn't, and she fought for the 7 points with the focused, non-theatrical tenacity that was her best professional quality. She gave up 2 things she'd have preferred to keep in order to win the 4 that mattered most. She got the workforce retention clause extended to 22 months with graduated penalty provisions. Better than she'd asked for, because she'd asked for 18 and they'd expected her to ask for 12. She restructured the earn-out to a format that aligned incentives with long-term plant health rather than short-term extraction. The engineering development program took the longest. The buyer's team pushed back 3 times, characterizing it as redundant to their standard operational model. Charlotte held. She came to one of those meetings with documentation, specific quantified documentation that Ethan had helped her build, showing the operational value of what the program had produced over 3 months. Reduced maintenance costs, faster diagnostic response times. The Priya Ramesh situation translated into dollar figures as a retention and development investment that had already paid back twice its cost in avoided turnover. Numbers the buyer's team understood because they were the language the buyer's team thought in. The program stayed. She came back from the final negotiation session on a Friday afternoon and walked directly to the workshop, still in the blazer she'd worn to the meeting, and told him the outcome point by point. He listened the way he listened, which was completely. The earnout, he said? Modified. The structure now rewards sustainable margin over 3 years rather than short-term cost reduction. It's not perfect, but it's workable. The program? Protected. Explicitly named in the operational continuity clause as a retained function. He was quiet for a moment. You got all of it. I didn't get all of it, she said. I got the things that mattered and gave up the things I could give up. He looked at her with an expression that was something between respect and something warmer than respect, and didn't say the thing he was probably thinking because he didn't need to. The board meeting is Monday, she said. I'm going to recommend the deal. Good, he said. She leaned against the bench. She was tired. 3 weeks of hard negotiation tired, the kind that sat in the body. It's a good outcome for the plant, she said. It's not a perfect outcome. There are no perfect outcomes in these things. I know, he said. There will be a transition period that's disruptive. New ownership always is. There will be people who aren't sure what it means for them, and there's a limit to what I can promise. She looked at the floor for a moment. I'm going to be honest with the floor about that. Same way I was honest in March. They deserve to know what's real. They do, he said, and they'll respond better to the real thing than to a managed message. People always do. She looked at him. When did you get good at organizational communication? I learned from someone, he said, and the directness of it was so unguarded that she had to look away for a second, out the workshop door at the floor, before she looked back. Ethan, she said. Yeah. Come to the board meeting Monday, not as engineering director, as someone who knows this plant better than anyone in that room will ever know it, and who can answer the questions I can't answer. He was quiet. Bringing a plant-level employee into a board meeting was not standard practice. They both knew that. Is that a good idea? He said. Probably not in the conventional sense, she said. But the conventional approach to this plan is what produced March. And I'm done with the conventional approach. He thought about it honestly. Okay, he said. Okay? Yeah, he said. What time? 9 a.m. Wear something that isn't flannel. He looked down at himself. I own other things. I know you do, she said. I've seen them approximately twice. The board meeting was not simple because nothing with Gerald Harrow in the room was ever simple. But it was, in the end, what it needed to be. Charlotte presented the deal. She walked through the terms with the clarity she brought to everything, and the board listened with the particular attention of people who understood the numbers represented real money and real decisions. Gerald asked 3 questions, all of them probing, and 2 of them genuinely good questions that Charlotte answered without hedging. Then Gerald looked at Ethan, who was sitting at the end of the table in a dark jacket and a collared shirt and his characteristic stillness, and asked, And you, what's your read on this? It was not standard for a board to address a non-executive attendee directly. Several people shifted slightly. Charlotte held still. Ethan looked at Gerald for a moment, reading him the way he read everything, honestly, without performing either deference or confidence. The deal structure is sound, he said. The clauses that protect the workforce and the development program are real protections, not cosmetic ones. The earnout modification means whoever's running the plant after close has a financial reason to invest in it rather than cut it. He paused. The risk is the transition period. New ownership creates uncertainty, and uncertainty makes people conservative, and conservative in a manufacturing environment means problems get hidden instead of reported. That's a culture risk, not a contractual one. And how do you address a culture risk? Gerald said. You don't address it with policy, Ethan said. You address it by making sure the people on the floor believe that reporting problems is safe. That takes time and consistency, and it's not something a term sheet can guarantee. He met Gerald's gaze. What I can tell you is that this plant has spent the last 3 months building exactly that culture. Whether it survives the transition depends on whether the new ownership understands what they're buying, which is not just equipment and contracts. It's 431 people who have learned to trust the place they work. The room was quiet. Gerald looked at Ethan for a long moment. He looked at Charlotte. He looked back at the term sheet. "I have no further questions," he said. The board voted to approve the transaction 7-1. Gerald was the one. Charlotte expected that and had prepared for it, and 7-1 was more than sufficient. After the meeting, in the hallway outside the conference room, Charlotte fell into step beside Ethan as they walked toward the elevator. She didn't say anything for a moment. 431, she said finally. What? You said 431 people. That's the exact number. I know how many people work here, he said. Most executives don't know the number within 50. I'm not most executives, he said. I'm not really an executive at all. You just presented to a board of directors. You made me do that. You were good at it. He was quiet for a second. It's easier when the thing you're saying is true, he said. I just said what I actually think. The elevator opened. They got in. The doors closed. What do you actually think, Charlotte said, about what happens next? He thought about it. I think the plant comes out of this okay, he said. I think the deal is real, and the protections are real. And Marcus is going to take the transition personally and work himself half to death making sure it goes well. And Priya is going to impress whoever the new ownership sends to evaluate operations. And Darren is going to finish his degree next spring, and I'm going to have to fight to keep him because someone better will try to recruit him. The elevator opened on the lobby. And you? Charlotte said. He looked at her. I think I'm exactly where I should be, he said, for the first time in a while. She held his gaze. The lobby was busy around them, people moving through, the ordinary traffic of a building in the middle of a working day, and neither of them moved for a moment. Me too, she said. Trebis, the company family celebration was Charlotte's idea, and she would later not be entirely able to explain why she'd decided to do it in December rather than waiting for the standard end-of-year timeline. Partly it was the acquisition close, which had gone through without the complications she'd braced for, and which deserved acknowledgement. Partly it was the Marcus and new baby energy that had been running through the plant for weeks, which had created an unusual warmth in the building that seemed worth feeding rather than letting dissipate. Partly it was because she wanted to give Ava a reason to come. It was a Saturday. The plant floor transformed with the somewhat improbable effort of 100 people who'd brought things from home and spent Friday afternoon hanging lights and setting up tables with the cheerful, slightly chaotic efficiency of people who are genuinely glad to be doing something together. Marcus had organized most of it. He was that kind of person, the one who made community happen without making you feel like he was making it happen, which was a genuine talent that didn't show up in any org chart. Charlotte arrived at 10 in the morning and spent 2 hours moving through the space, talking to people. Not the managed conversation of a CEO working a room, but actual talking, the kind she'd gotten better at over the months of break room coffees and floor walks. She knew names now, not just faces. She knew that the older woman on line 2 who always nodded at her from the cutting station had a granddaughter starting college next year. She knew that the young man from the night shift who kept submitting ideas to the improvement suggestion system had an actual gift for process optimization that she'd asked Ethan to look at developing. She knew things that didn't live in files. Ethan arrived at 11 with Ava, who was wearing a red sweater and had her hair in a braid that was slightly lopsided in the way that suggested she'd done it herself. She came through the door and immediately took in the transformed floor with wide, assessing eyes. They moved the machines, Ava said. Some of them, Ethan said. To make room for the tables, she said. Smart. She said it with the proprietary familiarity of someone who felt she had a stake in the place, which, Charlotte thought, watching from across the floor, she kind of did. Charlotte came over. Ava looked up at her and then down at her own sweater and then up again. You're also wearing red, Ava said. I am, Charlotte said. We didn't plan that, Ava said to Ethan. who was looking between them with the particular expression of a man who understood that certain dynamics were now slightly beyond his management. "We didn't," Charlotte confirmed. "It looks good," Ava said, with the decisive finality of a child handing down a verdict. She moved past them toward the food tables, which had acquired her attention. Charlotte looked at Ethan. He looked at her. The thing between them that had been named in the workshop and had been present in every conversation since was there in the look. Not hidden, not performed, just there, the way real things are there when they've been acknowledged. "She's going to be very difficult when she's a teenager," Charlotte said. "I'm aware," he said. "I've been steeling myself since she was 6. "She'll be wonderful," Charlotte said. "Difficult and wonderful." He looked at her with the quiet certainty that she'd come to understand was not complacency, but was its opposite, the specific piece of a person who has decided what matters and made their life around it. "Yeah," he said, "she will." The afternoon moved the way good afternoons move, and not with the forced momentum of events that are trying too hard, but with the natural current of people who are glad to be somewhere together. Marcus gave a speech that was 3 minutes long and made 2 people cry, which he'd claimed beforehand he wasn't trying to do. Priya Ramesh was there with a friend from outside the company, and Charlotte watched her move through the space with a new ease, the ease of someone who'd been told, clearly and structurally, that they were valued, and who was starting to believe it. Darren Cole found Ethan at one point and talked to him for 20 minutes about his night school program, and Ethan listened with the attention he gave everything, and Charlotte, passing by, caught the tail end of it. Darren saying something about a gear dynamics course he was taking, Ethan saying, "Come find me next week. I have something that'll make that course make sense," and filed it alongside all the other things she'd been filing for months, the texture of who this man was in practice, not in theory. Late in the afternoon, the crowd had thinned slightly, people with children leaving, the older workers heading out before dark. And Charlotte found herself standing at the far end of the floor near the Line 3 bay, looking at the machine that had started all of it. It was quiet now, the holiday shutdown meaning the lines had been idled since yesterday. But the housing was there, the drive assembly, the bearing that Ethan had replaced in 50 minutes 8 months ago while the whole plant held its breath. She heard footsteps and knew, without turning, who it was. Ethan stood beside her, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cool air of the floor. They both looked at the machine. "You know," Charlotte said, "every time I look at this line now, I think about what I almost did." "Stop thinking about it as what you almost did," he said. "Think about it as what you actually did." She looked at him. "You stood up in front of 400 people and said you were wrong," he said. "You gave Priya a track that should have been hers a year earlier. You went into that negotiation and fought for the things that mattered instead of the things that looked good on a deal summary." He paused. "The March thing is part of the story. It's not the whole story." Charlotte looked back at the machine. She was quiet for a moment with the quality of someone absorbing something they needed to hear. "I'm still working on that," she said. "I know," he said. "So am I. Different things, same work." Ava appeared from the direction of the tables with a paper plate and the expression of someone who had made several good decisions at the dessert station. She stopped when she saw them together. She looked at Ethan. She looked at Charlotte. She looked at the space, or lack of it, between them. She looked back at Ethan. "So this is a thing now?" she said. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Charlotte pressed her lips together to keep the laugh inside. "Ava," Ethan said. "I'm asking," Ava said, with complete reasonableness. "It's a valid question." "Yes," Charlotte said, before Ethan could navigate to a more carefully phrased answer. "It's a thing now." Ava processed this. She looked at Charlotte with the direct, serious gaze that she used when she was deciding something important. "Okay," she said. She took a bite of whatever was on her plate. "Are you going to be weird about it?" "I'm going to try not to be," Charlotte said. "Good," Ava said. "My dad gets weird about things sometimes. You should know that." "Hey," Ethan said. "It's true," Ava said. "You took 3 weeks to tell me you'd signed up for the director job because you were worried I'd think the schedule would change. The schedule was a valid concern. You sent me a text with a whole paragraph about it. A paragraph is not weird. It had bullet points, Ava said. Charlotte did not manage to contain the laugh this time. It came out fully and without apology, and Ethan looked at her with an expression of profound, affectionate resignation, and Ava watched this exchange with the satisfied attention of someone watching a system behave exactly as expected. "You're on her side," Ethan said to Charlotte. "I'm not on anyone's side," Charlotte said, still laughing. The bullet points are very on brand." "Can we talk about something else?" Ethan said. "The bullet points thing is going to come up again," Ava said helpfully. "Just so you know." She moved off toward the tables again, satisfied, leaving the two of them standing beside the Line 3 machine in the quiet of the afternoon. Ethan looked at Charlotte. She looked back at him. He shook his head slowly, without actual annoyance, with the particular helplessness of a parent who has created something they can no longer fully control. "She's 8, Charlotte said. "She's been like this since she was 5, he said. "I thought it would get better." "It won't," Charlotte said. "It'll get more articulate." He looked at the ceiling briefly and then back at her. Then he did something that was not complicated. He reached over and took her hand, the way you take someone's hand when you've decided to stop treating it as a complicated thing and just do it. His hand was warm and slightly rough, and it fit around hers without ceremony. They stood beside the machine that had nearly ended everything and had instead, in the way things sometimes work when you're not managing them too tightly, become the beginning of something. The plant was quiet around them. The afternoon light through the high windows had gone the particular amber of December late afternoons, long and warm and a little melancholy, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they mean something. The tables were still set up on the floor, the decorations from Marcus's enthusiastic planning still overhead, and across the space, the people who kept this place alive were doing what people do when they're somewhere they belong, talking, laughing, lingering. Charlotte looked at it all and felt, under her breastbone, the weight of a year. The March morning that had felt like a catastrophe. The 50 minutes when she'd stood on the floor and watched Ethan Walker work and begun to understand, at the deep structural level where real understanding lives, how wrong she'd been about what she could see from a second-floor window. The 17-item list, the board meeting, the negotiation, the accumulation of mornings. You could build a framework around almost anything, she'd learned. You could create metrics and protocols and escalation pipelines and approval structures, and all of those things mattered. She still believed they mattered, would always believe they mattered. But underneath all of it, the thing that actually determined whether a place worked or failed was simpler and harder than any framework. It was whether the people in it felt seen, whether the knowledge in their hands and heads and years of experience was treated as something real, something worth protecting, something the institution was built to value rather than just extract. She thought she understood that when she'd arrived. She'd had it in the right vocabulary. She hadn't had it in her body yet. She had it now. There's something about the people we overlook that we don't talk about enough. Not because the overlooking is always malicious. Most of the time it isn't. It's structural. It's the natural tendency of institutions to see what they've built systems to see, and to miss what falls outside those systems. The person who does the unglamorous maintenance that keeps everything running, the analyst who files the report that gets buried, the junior employee who knows the answer nobody's asked for yet. They're there. In every organization, in every building, caring more than their title says. The cost of not seeing them isn't always dramatic. Usually it's quiet. A slow accumulation of things that could have been better, problems that didn't get caught in time, people who stopped reporting because nobody listened. Occasionally it's a machine failure and 3 military helicopters in a parking lot in March. What Ethan Walker had known, what he'd built his whole hidden life around, was that the work itself was the point. Not the recognition, not the title, not the career architecture. The actual thing done by actual hands, making something work that didn't work before. He'd walked away from a prestigious career not because he'd stopped caring about the work, but because the work had stopped being the point. It had become context for a career, scaffolding for a reputation. And somewhere in that process, the thing itself, the real, physical, this bearing needs to be this precise thing, had gotten buried. He dug back down to it, deliberately, at significant cost, with clear eyes about what he was giving up. There are people who would look at that choice and see failure. A man with a doctorate working a Tech 2 job, a world-class engineer running maintenance checks on agricultural equipment, And there are people who would look at it and see something else entirely. A person who decided, at 32, that he already knew what mattered and organized his life around it without apology. Ava was 8 years old. She would be 9 in March. She had learned to swim competitively and braid her own hair and do fractions in a way that finally made sense. And she had a father who was there at 3:15 every day without exception, who made grilled cheese when she asked for it, who talked about work at dinner now in a way he hadn't for years. And she had apparently Charlotte Hayes, who wore red on Saturdays and was better at fractions than expected, and who had made a decision 11 months after the worst professional mistake of her career that the most important things were also the most straightforward ones. Be honest, fix what you break, and pay attention to the people in front of you. Simple principles. Not easy. There's a difference. Ethan let go of Charlotte's hand when Ava came back with a second plate that was very clearly dessert rather than any category of actual food, and Ava registered this with the expression of someone who found it unnecessary but was choosing not to comment. "Can we go see the machines?" Ava asked. "The ones that are off." "They're not a tourist attraction," Ethan said. "I know what they are," Ava said. "I want to see line 3. You told me about the bearing thing. I want to see where it is." Ethan looked at her for a moment with the expression of a parent faced with a child who has been listening more carefully than they were given credit for. He looked at Charlotte. "Line 3 is technically still my plant," Charlotte said. "For another 6 weeks. I say she can see it." Ava looked at Ethan with the expression of someone who had just gained a significant ally. The three of them walked to the Line 3 bay. The quiet machine, the drive assembly housing, the specific point where everything had converged 8 months ago. Ethan crouched down beside the housing and pointed to the bearing assembly. He explained it to Ava the way he explained things, which was without condescension and without oversimplification, with the assumption that she could follow if he found the right path in. Ava crouched beside him and looked at where he was pointing. "That's the one that broke?" she said. "That's where it broke," he said. "The bearing itself was replaced. This is the new one. Does it look different?" "Not from here. You'd need instruments to see the difference." He paused. "But it runs differently. If you put your hand on the housing when it's running, you'd feel it." Ava looked at the housing. She reached out and put her hand flat against the metal, even though the machine was off and there was nothing to feel, and the gesture was so purely her, the belief that contact with a thing was the right way to understand it, that Ethan had to look away for a second. Charlotte, standing behind them, watched the two of them crouched beside the machine, the engineer and his daughter, making contact with the thing that had changed everything, and felt the warmth in her chest that had been building all year arrive fully, without qualification. There are things you look for in your life, and there are things that arrive through a chain of accidents and mistakes, and a bearing housing that finally failed at the worst possible moment. The second kind is usually better. Not because the path to them was easier, but because the path has made you certain. You've earned your way to certainty. She'd earned hers. Ava stood up and brushed her hands on her jeans. She looked at Charlotte with the direct assessment Charlotte had come to love, which was what it was. Love, the honest, uncomplicated kind that starts as attention. "Okay," Ava said. "Can we get more food?" Ethan stood up. He put a hand briefly on the machine housing, old habit, or something more deliberate, she couldn't tell, and then straightened and looked at Charlotte in the December afternoon light. "Yeah," he said. "Let's get more food." They walked back across the floor together. Ava slightly ahead, already charting her path to the tables, Ethan and Charlotte behind her, close in the way that people are close when they've decided to be. And the plant ran silent around them, resting, waiting for Monday when the machines would start again and the work would continue, and 431 people would come through the doors and do the essential, undervalued, world-maintaining thing that people do when they show up for each other. The decorations caught the light. The tables were full. Marcus was laughing at something someone had said, holding his phone with the baby photos ready in case anyone needed convincing. Priya was talking to the night shift supervisor with the ease of someone who'd stopped expecting closed doors. Darren was eating an enormous amount of food with the unapologetic appetite of a 23-year-old who'd worked a full shift before arriving. Ava reached the table and turned back to see if they were following, with the expression of someone checking that the people she cared about were still there. They were there. She turned back to the food. Ethan looked at Charlotte. Charlotte looked at Ethan. Not bad, she said. For a year that started the way it started. Not bad, he agreed. They had more food, and the afternoon kept going in the good way afternoons keep going when you're finally somewhere you belong. And outside the Pennsylvania winter was doing its thing with the early dark and the cold. And inside the plant was warm and full of the sound of people who had, through a year of hard and ordinary things, found their way to a version of themselves they could live with. That's not a small thing. That's, in fact, the whole thing.